What if some of the most reported alien encounters aren't with grays, but something far stranger? Across multiple abduction accounts, witnesses describe towering insect-like beings, often called Mantis Beings, with long limbs, large eyes, and an unsettling, calm presence. Even more strange, these entities are sometimes said to be in control, observing or overseeing other alien interactions. But why do so many unrelated reports describe the same insectoid figures? Are these beings real extraterrestrials, or something happening inside the human mind? In this video, we explore the mystery of the Mantis Beings and why they keep appearing in some of the most disturbing alien encounter stories. There is a category of experience that sits at the outermost boundary of what the human mind is willing to accept. It lives in the space between sleep and waking, between memory and dream, between the world we inherited at birth and the world that seems, according to tens of thousands of credible witnesses across every continent and every culture, to be operating just beyond the threshold of ordinary perception. It is an experience that psychiatrists have studied, that military personnel have reported, that children have described before they had the vocabulary to fabricate, and that elderly men and women have recalled on their deathbeds with a clarity that made those around them stop and reconsider everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. It is the experience of contact, not with something warm and comforting, not with something that fits neatly into the categories of science fiction or theology, but with something ancient, calculating, and utterly profoundly non-human in every sense that phrase can carry. Of all the entities that populate the vast and disturbing literature of alien contact, one figure has emerged in recent decades with a consistency and specificity that researchers find impossible to dismiss. It is not the gray alien of popular culture, though that figure has its own complex and well-documented history. It is not the Nordic humanoid, not the reptilian, not the small luminous beings of folklore. It is something that most people, upon first encountering the accounts, find almost too strange to process, and yet, upon deeper examination, something that reveals a coherence, a detail, and a cross-cultural consistency that places it in a category all its own. The entity is tall. It is thin in a way that suggests a different relationship with gravity than the one we have. It has a triangular or elongated head that in its overall geometry resembles nothing so much as the head of a praying mantis. It has enormous eyes, often described as multifaceted or deeply dark, set at angles that no human face has ever accommodated. Its limbs are long and jointed in ways that human limbs are not, bending at unexpected places, moving with a fluid deliberateness that witnesses struggle to articulate without resorting to comparisons with insects. In some accounts, it has wings, folded against its back like the wings of a beetle in repose. In others, it wears robes or garments of some kind, as though it understands or performs the concept of clothing for reasons that may or may not relate to modesty or temperature. In nearly every account, it radiates something that witnesses uniformly describe not as malevolence and not as warmth, but as a kind of profound cosmic authority, as though it has been doing whatever it does for longer than the human species has existed, and it knows this, and it expects you to sense this, and it is entirely correct in that expectation. These are the Mantis Beings, and their story, the story of what they are, where they come from, what they want, and what their presence in human experience might mean, is one of the most extraordinary and underreported phenomena of our era. It is a story that requires the listener to hold in mind simultaneously the most rigorous standards of empirical inquiry and a willingness to consider possibilities so far outside the conventional model of reality that the mere act of taking them seriously feels, at first, like a kind of intellectual transgression. But intellectual transgressions have a way of becoming, in hindsight, the moments when understanding took a step forward. And the weight of the evidence surrounding the Mantis Beings, the sheer volume of it, the geographic distribution of it, the demographic diversity of those who have reported it, the specific and repeating details that appear in accounts gathered by different researchers in different countries from people who have never heard of each other, demands, at minimum, that we look. The history of the Mantis beings in the modern era of UFO and contact research does not have a single clean origin point. Unlike the Roswell incident, which has a date and a place and a set of physical claims attached to it, the Mantis phenomenon accumulated gradually, like sediment, as researchers began to notice that across their independently gathered case files, a particular entity kept appearing. It appeared in the hypnotic regression transcripts of the 1970s. It appeared in the voluntary recalled accounts of the 1980s. It appeared in the childhood memories of people who only came forward in the 1990s. It appeared in the night terrors of people who had never read a single book about UFOs and who, when shown artist renditions of the entity they described, broke down in a way that went well beyond what any performance of confusion could produce. It appeared in cultures that have no shared mythological vocabulary with each other, described in languages that have no loan words between them, by people whose social contexts gave them absolutely no incentive to fabricate. To understand the Mantis beings properly, you have to start not with the most dramatic cases, but with the architecture of the phenomenon itself. What does it mean for something to appear consistently across thousands of independent reports? In science, consistency is the beginning of pattern recognition, and pattern recognition is the beginning of understanding. The consistency here is not the vague consistency of people saying they saw something strange in the sky. It is the very specific consistency of people providing matching architectural details of an entity that, by any conventional account, should not exist. The triangular head, the compound or deeply dark eyes, the unusual joint structure of the limbs, the height, typically between 6 and 7 feet, sometimes more, the quality of presence, the sense that this being is not merely physically large but ontologically large, occupying more of reality in some way than its physical dimensions should allow. These details repeat. They repeat across continents. They repeat across decades. They repeat in the accounts of children and the accounts of decorated military veterans. They repeat in cultures with no shared folklore about such beings. And they cannot all be explained by contamination from popular media, because many of the earliest accounts predate the popularization of any such image, and because many of those who report encounters actively resist the comparison to anything they've seen in culture, insisting that what they experienced was realer, more complex, and more disturbing than any image they have encountered. The Mantis beings do not operate in isolation. This is one of the most important structural facts about the phenomenon, and one that is frequently misunderstood. They appear, in the majority of accounts, in the company of other entities, most commonly the small gray beings who have become the dominant symbol of alien contact in popular culture, but also other humanoid figures whose nature and origin remain disputed. In these mixed entity scenarios, the Mantis figure occupies what witnesses consistently describe as a supervisory or commanding role. The Greys appear to take direction from the Mantis, to defer to it, to move out of its way when it approaches. The Mantis figure is often described as entering a room or a space and immediately commanding the attention of everyone and everything within it, including the witness, who typically reports a profound and involuntary shift in their own neurological state. A sudden stillness, a flooding sense of presence, a feeling that has been described variously as awe, terror, reverence, and sometimes an almost unwilling intimacy, as though the being is not merely looking at the witness, but reading them in some way that goes far deeper than visual observation. This hierarchical positioning of the Mantis within the contact scenario has led many researchers to a conclusion that sounds, on first encounter, extraordinary: that the Mantis beings may represent not merely one more variety of alien visitor among many, but something more fundamental, something older, something that may in fact be at or near the top of whatever organizational structure governs the phenomenon as a whole. The implications of that possibility are enormous, and we will explore them at length. But first, we need to establish the foundation. We need to understand what the witness literature actually says in its full complexity before we begin to interpret it. We need to hear the experiences, not as curiosities, not as symptoms, but as data. The data of human encounter with something that appears to be as real as the table it is sitting across from you, as real as the light in the room, as real as the terror and the wonder that witnesses report in equal and overwhelming measure. We need to understand that the people who have experienced the Mantis beings are not, as a group, mentally ill, attention-seeking, or confused. They are your neighbors, your colleagues, your family members, your country's military and government servants. They are the full demographic range of human society, distributed across the planet, connected by nothing except the specificity and the weight of what they have been through. The study of non-human intelligences, and this is the precise, careful language that an increasing number of serious researchers are now using, has evolved dramatically over the course of the past half-century. What began as a fringe curiosity, dismissed by mainstream science with a contempt that said more about institutional defensiveness than about the quality of the evidence, has gradually, and particularly in recent years, become a subject of increasingly serious inquiry. Governments that spent decades officially denying any interest in the phenomenon have quietly, and in some cases not so quietly, acknowledged that they have been studying it all along. Scientists who built careers on dismissing UFO reports as misidentifications of mundane phenomena have begun, in later career, to express views considerably more nuanced than their public position suggested. The stigma remains powerful, but stigma, in the history of science, has never been a reliable guide to truth. It has merely been a reliable guide to comfort. Within this evolving field, the Mantis being represents a specific and profound puzzle, because if the gray alien phenomenon, with all its complexity, can be provisionally filed under the category of something that requires more investigation, the Mantis being demands more than that. Its characteristics, physical, behavioral, and experiential, place it in a category that challenges not merely our models of biology and extraterrestrial life, but our models of consciousness, of time, of the relationship between matter and mind. The accounts in which Mantis beings appear are, as a general rule, the most complex, the most layered, and the most philosophically charged of all contact accounts. Witnesses who have encountered Mantis beings report not merely physical interaction, but a kind of cognitive and spiritual reorganization. They report that the encounter did not just happen to them. It changed them, permanently, in ways that they are still, years and decades later, trying to understand. This documentary will not tell you what the Mantis beings are, not with the certainty that the subject deserves and that our current state of knowledge cannot provide. What it will do is lay out, as fully and honestly as possible, what we know, what we think we know, and what the evidence suggests, leaving the synthesis to you. Because if there is one thing that the study of this phenomenon teaches, very quickly, it is that the witness is not a passive recipient of data. The witness is a participant in something, and you, in hearing these accounts, become a witness of a different kind, to the accounts themselves, to the pattern, to the question that the pattern raises, and that once raised, does not go away. The praying mantis is one of the oldest insects on Earth. The fossil record shows mantis-like creatures existing more than 100 million years ago, long before the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, long before the emergence of the first primates. As a form, the mantis represents something that nature found and kept, a body plan so efficient, so well suited to its function, that it required no fundamental redesign over geological timescales. The mantis is a predator. It is a patient predator. It waits, absolutely still, for periods of time that would exhaust any creature less supremely adapted to the act of stillness. And then, with a speed that is literally one of the fastest movements in the animal kingdom, it strikes. What it has is not merely physical capability. It has, in the vocabulary of evolutionary biology, something that functions like strategy. It has spatial awareness of unusual sophistication. It is one of the very few invertebrates known to have stereoscopic vision, true three-dimensional perception of the world. It can track moving objects with its head while keeping its body utterly motionless. and it cleans itself with a methodical, deliberate care that observers across centuries have found distinctly uncanny in a creature of its kind. None of this, of course, is to suggest that the beings reported in abduction cases are terrestrial mantises scaled up and given intelligence. The comparison is geometric, not taxonomic. But the comparison, made by virtually every witness who encounters the beings, is not accidental. Something about the overall architecture of the being, the way it holds itself, the way it moves, the way it watches, triggers the comparison in the human visual and associative system so reliably that it has become the defining label for the phenomenon, the Mantis Beings. And in that label is compressed a century of confusion, fear, wonder, and the slowly accumulating conviction of researchers who have spent their careers in this field that whatever is showing up in these accounts, it is not nothing. It is not nothing. That is where we begin. And from there, we go as far as the evidence takes us. The modern era of UFO research is conventionally dated to June 1947, when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 objects near Mount Rainier in Washington state, moving in a way that no known aircraft of the period could account for. Arnold's report generated the term flying saucer, which became within weeks a cultural phenomenon and which set in motion a process of public and private inquiry that has continued in various forms for the better part of a century. But the Arnold sighting was about objects, not about beings. The question of who, if anyone, was operating those objects and what they might look like and what they might want remained in the immediate post-war years largely speculative. The first major wave of entity contact reports in the modern era came in the 1950s, and they were dominated by a type of experience that researchers came to call the contactee phenomenon. Figures like George Adamski, Howard Menger, and Orfeo Angelucci claimed regular, often pleasant encounters with beings who were, in their accounts, very similar to attractive Nordic humans. Tall, blonde, with a benevolent interest in Earth's welfare and a tendency to deliver philosophical messages about nuclear disarmament and cosmic brotherhood. These accounts were received with varying degrees of credulity, and subsequent investigation has raised serious questions about their authenticity. But they set the tone for a certain kind of public narrative about alien contact. One characterized by accessibility, warmth, and a kind of Aryan aesthetic that said as much about the cultural anxieties of Cold War America as it did about any genuine phenomenon. The Mantis Beings belong to a very different tradition. They appear not in the conscious, daylight, quasi-voluntary encounters of the 1950s contactee movement, but in the darker, more disorienting, more physically and psychologically intense accounts that began to accumulate in significant numbers from the 1960s onward. Accounts characterized not by invitation and choice, but by intrusion and involuntary participation. Accounts in which the witness is not a guest, but, in many descriptions, more like a specimen. And it is in these accounts, the abduction accounts, the encounter reports gathered under hypnotic regression and increasingly in conscious, voluntary recollection, that the Mantis figure begins to appear, at first rarely, then with increasing frequency, and always in a position of authority. The canonical abduction account of the modern era is the story of Betty and Barney Hill, which took place in September 1961 in New Hampshire, and which became the subject of John Fuller's 1966 book, The Interrupted Journey. The Hills reported being stopped on a rural road by a craft that descended from the sky, and subsequently experiencing what appeared to be missing time, a gap in their conscious recollection of several hours that they could not account for. Under hypnotic regression with Dr. Benjamin Simon, both Betty and Barney independently described being taken aboard a craft and subjected to medical-type examinations by beings described in ways that broadly match what later became the canonical gray alien description, small, with large heads and dark eyes. What is less often noted but significant in the context of the Mantis phenomenon is that Barney Hill's descriptions, under hypnosis, occasionally reference beings of varying sizes and apparent levels of authority, with the suggestion of a hierarchy among the entities. This hierarchical observation would become one of the defining structural features of abduction accounts in subsequent decades, and it is within that hierarchy that the mantis figure consistently occupies the upper registers. By the 1970s, the abduction phenomenon had become, if not mainstream, at least a recognized category within the broader UFO research community. Researchers like Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who had originally worked for the Air Force's Project Blue Book and had begun his career as a committed skeptic, found themselves confronted with a body of evidence that their initial frameworks could not accommodate. Hynek's evolution from debunker to serious investigator is one of the important intellectual stories of 20th century anomalous research, and it reflects a pattern that has repeated itself many times, of rigorous, professionally qualified individuals whose encounter with the actual evidence forces a revision of their previously comfortable dismissiveness. It was in this period that hypnotic regression became a primary tool for recovering abduction memories, and with it came the detailed architecture of what encounters actually involved. Researchers like Bud Hopkins, a New York artist who became one of the most important figures in abduction research, began to accumulate case files that revealed not just the experience of individual witnesses, but a structured, repeating phenomenology. Hopkins worked with hundreds of witnesses over a career spanning several decades, and his work, controversial in many quarters but rigorously documented in others, helped establish the foundational vocabulary of the abduction experience. It was in the Hopkins case files, and in the parallel work of researchers like Dr. David Jacobs and Dr. John Mack, that the mantis being began to appear with enough consistency to demand its own analytical category. Dr. John Mack deserves particular attention in this history, not merely because of the quality and volume of his casework, but because of who he was. Mack was not a UFO enthusiast operating at the margins of respectable discourse. He was a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, and a man whose intellectual credentials were as impeccable as his reputation for intellectual honesty. When Mack began to take the abduction phenomenon seriously, not as pathology, not as delusion, but as a genuine category of human experience that demanded investigation on its own terms, the response from his institution was, to put it mildly, complicated. He faced a formal inquiry from Harvard that, while ultimately concluding in his favor, illustrated with painful clarity the institutional cost of taking anomalous phenomena seriously in an academic context. Mack did not flinch. He continued his work. He traveled the world interviewing witnesses. He brought to the study of the abduction phenomenon a clinical and philosophical rigor that had not previously characterized the field, and his two major books on the subject, Abduction in 1994 and Passport to the Cosmos in 1999, remain essential texts for anyone who wishes to understand the phenomenon at the level it actually operates. In Mack's case files, the mantis being appears with notable frequency. Mack was careful to note that many of his subjects reported a hierarchical structure among the beings they encountered, and that the entity which consistently appeared at or near the top of that hierarchy was distinctive in its appearance, its manner, and the quality of the experience it generated in those who encountered it. Mack described encounters with beings who communicated not through spoken language, but through a kind of direct mental contact, a transmission of meaning, image, and emotion that bypassed the normal channels of linguistic communication and arrived in the witness's awareness as something more like a weather pattern than a sentence. And he noted, carefully, that these transmissions were frequently accompanied by a sense of overwhelming, almost unbearable significance, as though what was being communicated was not merely information, but something closer to a fundamental restructuring of the witness's understanding of themselves and their place in the cosmos. This is characteristic mantis phenomenology, and it begins, in the hands of researchers like Mack, to look less like the delusion of disturbed individuals and more like the description of a genuine, consistent, and structurally complex phenomenon that our current scientific frameworks are not equipped to address. The geography of the mantis being reports is itself a significant data point. While the United States has the largest documented case literature, partly because of its size, partly because of the relative freedom of public discourse about anomalous phenomena, and partly because of the concentration of serious researchers. Mantis being reports come from every inhabited continent. From the United Kingdom, where the abduction experience has its own well-documented tradition, separate from, but parallel to the American one. From Brazil, which has a rich and underreported history of contact phenomena going back to the mid-20th century. From Australia, from South Africa, from Japan, from Russia, from India. The beings described in these diverse cultural and geographic contexts share the same essential characteristics, the same height, the same geometry of the head, the same jointed limbs, the same quality of commanding, hierarchical presence, the same mode of communication, direct, nonverbal, overwhelming in its intensity, the same aftermath, the witness left changed, often confused, frequently burdened with a sense of knowledge or mission that they cannot entirely articulate but that they cannot set aside. This cross-cultural consistency is not merely a curiosity. It is, from a scientific standpoint, one of the most important structural features of the phenomenon. If the mantis being were a product of cultural contamination, of people absorbing images from popular media and incorporating them into their own reported experiences, you would expect to see a strong correlation between media exposure and report content. You would expect the phenomenon to be concentrated in cultures with high media penetration and to be absent or significantly different in cultures with lower media exposure. You do not see this. You see the same entity described with the same essential characteristics by people whose access to any shared cultural image of such a being is minimal or non-existent. This is not proof of anything in the strict scientific sense, but it is evidence. And it is evidence that the mantis being cannot be straightforwardly reduced to a cultural artifact. Before we go further into the specific cases and the detailed phenomenology, it is worth pausing to acknowledge something that the study of this subject requires. It requires a certain kind of epistemic courage, not the courage to believe. Belief is cheap, and uncritical belief is no more epistemically courageous than uncritical disbelief. The courage required here is the courage to sit with genuine uncertainty, to look at the evidence honestly and to resist the pull, which is strong in both directions, toward premature conclusion. The debunker's comfort is in having a ready explanation. The believer's comfort is in having a ready answer. The researcher's work, the honest researcher's work, is in refusing both comforts and staying in the difficult, uncomfortable space of not quite knowing while continuing to gather and analyze and think. The mantis being puts enormous pressure on that space. Because the phenomenon is too consistent, too widespread, and too specifically detailed to be dismissed without intellectual dishonesty. And yet it is too extraordinary, too far outside the conventional models of what is possible, to be accepted without the kind of rigorous investigation that the field has historically struggled to provide. We are in a transitional moment in the study of this phenomenon, as in so many others. The old certainties are dissolving. The new understanding is not yet formed, and in that transitional space, the mantis being sits, enormous, patient, ancient, watching. It is time to look more closely at what it actually is. The body of the other, physical descriptions and anatomical consistency. When you read through hundreds of independent accounts of mantis being encounters, gathered by different researchers, from different witnesses, in different decades, in different countries, what strikes you first is not the strangeness of the descriptions. It is the specificity. Strangeness is easy. The human imagination, operating without constraint, produces infinite variety. But specificity, the repetition of particular concrete details across independent sources, is something that strangeness alone cannot account for. And the physical descriptions of the mantis beings across the full breadth of the documented literature are specific in ways that demand careful attention. Height is the first and most immediate characteristic that witnesses report. The beings are consistently described as tall, significantly taller than the average human male, with estimates ranging from around 6 feet to over 8 feet, depending on the witness and the context of the encounter. The most common range is between 6 and 7 feet, but reports of beings exceeding 7 feet are not uncommon, and a small number of accounts describe entities of 8 feet or more. This height, combined with the extreme thinness of the being's body, creates an overall impression that is both imposing and somehow wrong in a way that witnesses struggle to articulate. Wrong not in the sense of threatening, though threat is often part of the experience. Wrong in the deeper sense of belonging to a different set of physical laws, of representing a body plan that does not fit within the parameters of what terrestrial evolution has produced. The proportional relationship between height and body mass in the mantis being, as consistently described, is outside anything that the human musculoskeletal system or the terrestrial evolutionary record would predict. The being is very tall and very thin, but it carries itself with an authority and an apparent strength that its apparent physical fragility does not seem to warrant. This contradiction is itself a data point. The head is the feature that drives the mantis comparison, and it is described with remarkable consistency across independent accounts. It is triangular, not in the perfectly geometric sense of an equilateral triangle, but in the sense of tapering from a relatively wide upper cranium down to a pointed, or at least markedly narrow, lower face. The overall shape is elongated vertically, giving the impression of a head that is proportionally longer from top to chin than the human head, and narrower across the cheekbone line than human faces typically are. The forehead, in many descriptions, projects slightly forward or upward, giving a subtle but distinctly non-human quality to the overall cranial profile. There is frequently no visible nose in the conventional sense. Some witnesses describe a very small, flattened nasal region, or a few small openings, or simply the absence of the feature altogether. The mouth, when described, is typically small, a thin, horizontal line that rarely opens or moves in the way that human mouths do during communication, consistent with the overwhelming evidence that these beings communicate not through speech, but through some form of direct mental transmission. The eyes are where witness accounts most consistently become emotionally charged. Every description of the mantis being's eyes carries a weight and an intensity that the descriptions of other physical features do not. The eyes are large, very large relative to the size of the face, and set at angles that are consistent with the lateral placement of eyes in insects rather than the forward-facing placement of primate vision. But unlike the eyes of actual insects, which are compound structures producing a very different quality of visual experience than vertebrate eyes, the eyes of the mantis being are described as dark, deeply, profoundly dark, and as having a quality of depth, of interior complexity that witnesses find almost impossible to convey. Not blank, not empty. The opposite, full, as though the darkness of those eyes contains rather than excludes, as though looking into them is looking into something that has no bottom. Many witnesses describe an overwhelming sensation upon making eye contact with a mantis being, a sensation that ranges from deep, involuntary calm to raw, primal terror, and that is in either case experienced as something imposed rather than chosen, something coming from the eyes, entering the witness and doing something there, changing something, accessing something. The experience of the mantis gaze is one of the most consistently reported and most consistently disturbing elements of the entire phenomenon. Some witnesses describe a secondary eyelid or membrane, a translucent or semi-transparent covering that can move across the eye, producing what witnesses describe as a momentary dimming or shifting of the visual quality of the gaze. This detail appears in accounts gathered independently in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Brazil, among other locations, and it is the kind of highly specific anatomical detail that is difficult to explain through any process of cultural contamination or witness fabrication. It is the kind of detail that has no obvious referent in popular media or cultural imagery. And its appearance in independent accounts is precisely the sort of thing that researchers who are genuinely engaged with the question of whether these experiences correspond to something real find most significant. The neck of the mantis being, in accounts that address it, is described as long, thin, and somewhat flexible, capable of movement that human necks cannot perform, and giving the head a quality of independent mobility that witnesses find deeply unsettling when they observe it. The head can turn, in these descriptions, to degrees that should exceed the structural limits of even a highly flexible vertebrate neck. Some witnesses report seeing the head orient toward them in a way that implies a full rotational capability far beyond human range, again consistent with the mantis comparison, in which the head is famously capable of 180-degree rotation. Whether this reflects a genuine anatomical similarity or is a projection of the comparison onto an ambiguous observation is impossible to determine from the accounts alone, but the consistency of this detail across independent reports is notable. The body of the mantis being is consistently described as elongated and thin, with a chest or thoracic region that is relatively small compared to the overall height of the being, and a lower body that in some accounts has the multi-segmented quality of an insect's abdomen, while in others is more conventionally humanoid in its overall outline. This variation may reflect genuine anatomical diversity among beings of this type, or it may reflect differences in the garments or coverings that many witnesses report the beings as wearing, which may conceal the lower body's actual structure. The torso is never described as muscular in any conventional sense, yet the being's movements are never described as weak or uncertain, suggesting either that the being's physical strength operates according to different mechanical principles than human musculature, or that what witnesses observe is not a physically operating body in the conventional sense, but something whose relationship with the physical is more complex. The arms are one of the most distinctive and consistently described features of the mantis being, and they are where the insect comparison becomes most visually immediate. They are long, disproportionately long relative to the body, and they are jointed differently from human arms. The most common description involves multiple joints, or joints at positions that do not correspond to the human elbow and wrist. Some witnesses describe a folding or resting position for the arms that is strongly reminiscent of the prayer position of an actual praying mantis. The forelimbs, held up and forward, bent at the mid-joint, sometimes described as though in a perpetual attitude of supplication or readiness. The hands, where described, are long-fingered and thin, with a varying number of digits. 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all reported, and a grip that witnesses who have experienced it describe as both gentle and absolute, unable to be broken or resisted, not through any application of force, but through some quality of the grip itself that seems to bypass the mechanics of physical resistance. The legs of the mantis being, in the accounts that describe them in detail, are similarly unusual, long and thin, with joints that may bend in directions not possible for human legs, and ending in feet that some witnesses describe as more claw-like than foot-like, while others describe them as essentially humanoid but very elongated. The way the mantis being moves is described in a way that does not entirely fit the mechanics of either insect locomotion or human bipedalism. Witnesses describe it as gliding or as moving with a deliberate, smooth quality that seems to lack the micro-adjustments and small inefficiencies of ordinary human movement. This quality of movement is reported so consistently that it has become one of the diagnostic markers for the mantis type. If a being moves in this smoothly deliberate way, with this quality of absolute physical intention, researchers flag it as a probable mantis encounter, even before the full physical description is gathered. The coloration of the mantis being is varied across accounts, though certain patterns predominate. Green, in shades ranging from pale, almost yellow-green to deep forest green, is the most commonly reported color, and it is obviously the color most immediately consistent with the mantis comparison. But brown and tan descriptions are also common, and a smaller but significant number of accounts describe beings that are gray, black, or even a pale, translucent, almost white. Whether these differences represent genuine species or type diversity, or individual variation, or differences in lighting conditions that affect the witness's perception of color, is not established. What is established is that no mantis being is ever described as being pink, red, or orange, the warm end of the human chromatic vocabulary for biological things. The cool and earthy colors of its reported spectrum are themselves consistent with a being whose evolutionary or developmental origin, wherever that might be, involved environments and pressures very different from the ones that produced warm mammalian pigmentation. Some witnesses report what appear to be vestigial or actual wings, typically described as folded against the back of the being, visible as large structured appendages with a quality reminiscent of beetle elytra, the hardened outer wing covers of beetles, rather than the transparent veined wings of insects like dragonflies. These wings are rarely, if ever, described as being used in the context of the encounter. They do not fly in any way that witnesses observe, and some researchers have suggested that what witnesses are perceiving may be equipment of some kind rather than biological features. Others take the wing descriptions at face value as evidence of a being that is more fully insectoid in its biology than the overall humanoid proportions might suggest. The wing reports are less universal than the other physical features. Perhaps 40 to 50% of accounts that go into detailed physical description mention them, but they are consistent enough to be considered a legitimate feature of the physical profile rather than an occasional anomaly. In a number of accounts, witnesses report that the mantis being is wearing garments of some kind. This is itself a significant observation, because the wearing of garments is a behavior associated with cultural beings, with beings that have a relationship with the concept of covering and adornment. The garments described are varied. Long robes or cloaks are common, sometimes described as having a heavy, textured quality, and sometimes as extremely light and almost luminous. Some witnesses describe garments that appear to have a functional character, belts or coverings of specific body regions that suggest equipment rather than fashion. Some describe what appear to be symbols or markings on the garments, though these are rarely described in enough detail to permit comparison across accounts. The most consistent garment description involves something long and dark-colored, often described as black or very dark brown, that covers the body from approximately the neck to the ankles, and that moves with the being in a way that seems slightly incongruent with its motion, as though it is heavier or lighter than the being's movement would suggest. The skin of the mantis being, in the accounts where skin is visible, is described as having a texture that is quite different from human skin. The most common description is of a surface that has a slight exoskeletal quality, not a true exoskeleton in the biological sense, but a surface that appears slightly harder, slightly more structured than soft mammalian skin. Some witnesses describe it as having a subtle surface texture, like very fine scales, or a very shallow geometric pattern. Others describe it as smooth, but in a way that seems wrong, too smooth, too uniform, lacking the pores and variations of human skin. A number of witnesses describe the skin as having a slight translucency in certain areas, particularly around the joints, where the underlying structure, whatever it is faintly visible. Whether this is a genuine anatomical feature or a perceptual artifact of the unusual lighting conditions that are typically present in encounter scenarios is not clear. The most consistent and most significant physical feature of the mantis being, beyond those already described, is one that is not strictly anatomical. It is the quality of presence. Every witness account of the mantis being, without exception, includes some description of the being's presence as a physical phenomenon in its own right, something experienced by the body of the witness as much as perceived by their visual system. This presence is described as something that the witness feels before they see the being, or that they continue to feel after the being has moved out of their visual field. It is described as pressure. Not painful pressure, but something heavy and inevitable, like the feeling of standing under something vast. It is described as a change in the atmosphere of the space the being occupies, an alteration in the quality of the air, the quality of the light, the quality of time itself. Witnesses frequently describe a sense of time slowing or stopping when in the presence of a mantis being, a sensation of being outside ordinary temporal flow in a way that is extremely disorienting and that leaves a lasting effect on the witness's experience of time in subsequent life. This quality of presence is not incidental to the physical description of the being. It is, arguably, the most important physical datum of all, because it suggests that the mantis being, whatever its nature, interacts with the physical environment of the encounter, including the physiological and neurological environment of the witness's body, in ways that go well beyond simple visual contact. Something is happening in those encounters at a level below the perceptual. Something is happening at the level of the body, the nervous system, the electromagnetic field. At whatever level, the architecture of human consciousness intersects with the external world, and whatever is happening there, the mantis being is the agent of it. The consistency of the physical descriptions across the full body of the literature is, as we have said, one of the defining arguments for taking the phenomenon seriously, but it is worth noting that this consistency does not mean uniformity. Within the consistent framework of the mantis being's essential characteristics, there is variation that may be taxonomically meaningful, or may reflect individual differences, or may reflect differences in the context and conditions of different encounters. There appear to be, based on the accumulated accounts, at least 2 or 3 distinguishable types or variations of mantis being. One type is consistently described as larger, more elaborately adorned or garmented, and more intensely authoritative in its bearing. This is the type that most often appears alone or in very small numbers, that commands the grays or other entities present, and that engages directly with the witness in the deepest and most transformative way. A second type is slightly smaller, less elaborately presented, and appears in slightly larger numbers. This type sometimes performs or supervises the more procedural aspects of the encounter, the examinations and collections and measurements that form the mundane infrastructure of the abduction scenario. A third possible variation, reported less frequently, is described as even more insectoid, less humanoid in its overall proportions, more visually difficult for witnesses to process, and appears primarily in accounts describing large, multi-entity gatherings rather than the more intimate one-to-one or small group encounters that characterize most mantis encounters. This apparent typological differentiation is significant because it suggests that what is being reported is not a single entity appearing in very similar guises, but something more like a species or family, an organized group of beings that share fundamental characteristics but exhibit the kind of individual and rank-based variation that one would expect of a socially organized, biologically diverse, or functionally differentiated species. This is not consistent with a cultural artifact. Cultural artifacts tend to be simpler, not more complex, as the number of independent reports grows. The mantis being phenomenon is getting more complex, more differentiated, more internally consistent with each generation of research. That trajectory is the trajectory of a real phenomenon being gradually, imperfectly mapped. One of the most important sources for detailed physical descriptions of the mantis being is the work of researchers who have developed systematic protocols for extracting and comparing physical detail from witness accounts. Barbara Lamb, a therapist and regression specialist who has worked with hundreds of contact experiencers over the course of her career, has documented mantis being descriptions with a precision and a clinical consistency that makes her case files among the most analytically useful in the field. Lamb's witnesses, drawn from a wide demographic range and gathered over many years, provide physical descriptions that are consistent in their fundamentals while providing the kind of nuanced variation that makes the data look like the outputs of real encounters rather than the products of any shared cultural template. Lamb has noted that in her experience, the witnesses who report mantis encounters are, as a group, among the most affected by their experiences, not necessarily in the most negative way, but in the most profound and lasting way. Something about contact with the mantis being, in her clinical observation, does something to the witness that other types of contact do not do in quite the same way. Mary Rodwell, the Australian researcher who has arguably done more than any other investigator in the Southern Hemisphere to document and analyze contact experiences, provides similar testimony. Rodwell has noted that Mantis Being descriptions in her case files, gathered primarily in Australia but including cases from across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, share the essential characteristics of the North American and European case literature, while occasionally providing details that have no obvious referent in the cultural material available to those witnesses. The specific quality of the eyes, the specific nature of the gaze, the specific quality of the presence. These appear in Australian cases with the same specificity and the same emotional charge that they appear with in American cases, described by people who have never read a UFO book and who, in some instances, have never heard the word abduction used in anything other than its criminal law sense. The physical evidence question, whether any tangible, materially verifiable evidence of the physical reality of these beings has been gathered, is one that the field has struggled with for decades. The absence of such evidence is the central challenge of the entire phenomenon. Witnesses report that things happen to their bodies, and in many cases, there are physical findings that are difficult to explain. Unusual skin markings, nosebleeds, implanted objects detected on imaging, physiological changes that medical examination cannot account for in conventional terms. But none of these, however anomalous, constitutes direct physical evidence of the beings themselves. No tissue sample, no clear technological artifact of unambiguous, non-terrestrial origin. No recording that captures the being directly rather than the witness's account of the being. This absence is frustrating, and it is frequently cited by critics of the field as sufficient reason to dismiss the entire body of witness testimony. But the absence of physical evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and the structural features of the phenomenon, the conditions under which encounters take place, the nature of the being's apparent capabilities, provide at least a plausible account of why physical evidence of the kind that conventional science would require has not been forthcoming. We will address this question at length later. For now, it is enough to note that the physical description literature, the witness accounts of what the mantis being looks like, how it moves, how it presents itself in the physical space of an encounter, is rich, specific, internally consistent, and cross-culturally distributed in ways that cannot be explained by any simple model of cultural contamination or collective delusion. Something is being described, the description is consistent. The question of what exactly it corresponds to remains one of the most important open questions of our time. The first witnesses, early and foundational encounter accounts. History has a way of hiding its most important stories in plain sight. The accounts that, in retrospect, turn out to have been the first documented instances of a significant and recurring phenomenon are often buried in the literature of the time, filed under the wrong categories, dismissed with the wrong frameworks, or simply overlooked because the context in which they occurred made them seem like individual anomalies rather than early data points in a larger pattern. The history of Mantis Being encounters is no exception to this principle. When you go back through the UFO and anomalous experience literature of the mid-20th century with the specific template of the Mantis Being in mind, you find accounts that, at the time of their documentation, were not specifically identified as mantis encounters because the category did not yet exist, but which, in their specific details, clearly belong to the same phenomenon. One of the earliest accounts that can plausibly be identified as a Mantis Being encounter comes from the voluminous files of Jacques Vallée, the French-American computer scientist and UFO researcher whose body of work represents one of the most intellectually rigorous engagements with the phenomenon that the field has produced. Vallée's database, which he assembled over decades from international sources, contains numerous early cases that describe entities of unusual height with insectoid characteristics in supervisory roles over other entities. Vallée's interpretive framework for these cases, his theory of a control system operating on human consciousness through phenomena that manifest in culturally appropriate forms, is itself a sophisticated and still relevant contribution to the theoretical landscape. The key point here is that the entities appearing at the top of this supposed control hierarchy, in the cases Vallée found most compelling, share characteristics that we now associate with the Mantis Being type. size, authority, unusual physical appearance, and a mode of interaction with witnesses that is more cognitive and transformative than physical. The Antonio Villas-Boas case, one of the most detailed and physically explicit abduction accounts in the literature, occurred in October 1957 on a farm in São Paulo State, Brazil. Villas-Boas, a young farmer, reported being taken aboard a craft by entities in protective suits and subjected to an encounter that included a sexual component involving a female humanoid. But what is relevant here is the broader physical context. The beings who initially apprehended Villas-Boas were described as wearing suits that concealed their bodies, but their movement, their grip, and their apparent organization under the command of a figure who seemed to have authority over the others was described in ways that several researchers, in retrospect, have found consistent with the organizational structure typical of encounters that include a mantis presence. Villas-Boas did not describe a mantis being explicitly, but the hierarchical organization of the encounter, with one being clearly commanding the others, overseeing the proceedings with an authority that the other entities visibly deferred to, is structurally consistent with the mantis encounter template. A more explicitly mantis-type account from the 1960s appears in the case files of the British UFO research organization Bufora and involves a witness in rural England who reported in the spring of 1968 an encounter with a tall, insect-like being that appeared in the witness's bedroom in the early morning hours. The witness, a middle-aged man with no prior interest in UFO phenomena, described a being that was approximately 7 feet tall, had a body that reminded him powerfully of a large praying mantis, and communicated with him in a way that he could only describe as thoughts being placed in my mind without any words. The witness reported that the encounter lasted approximately 40 minutes by his subjective experience, though he had no way of verifying the actual elapsed time, and that it left him with a persistent sense of having been given information that he could not fully access consciously, but that felt important and complete. The account was gathered by a Bufora investigator within weeks of the experience, before the witness had any opportunity to be influenced by other contact narratives and its specificity. The height, the body type, the mode of communication, the quality of the experience, places it firmly in the mantis encounter template, even in the absence of the specific terminology. The watershed period for mantis being documentation in the research literature is the 1980s and early 1990s, when the abduction research community, growing in size, becoming more methodologically sophisticated, and benefiting from the cross-pollination of independent case files, began to notice the pattern. Bud Hopkins, whose case files during this period numbered in the hundreds, observed that a subset of his witnesses described a being unlike the small gray entities that dominated most accounts. This being was large, commanded the attention and deference of the other entities present, and communicated with witnesses in a way that went beyond the clinical, procedure-focused interactions typical of gray entity encounters. Hopkins was cautious in his interpretations. He was always more comfortable with the accumulation of data than with its theoretical elaboration, but he noted the consistency of these larger, commanding entity reports and flagged them as a distinct category deserving separate analytical attention. David Jacobs, the Temple University historian who became one of the most important researchers of abduction experiences in the 1990s and 2000s, was more systematic in his categorization of entity types. Jacobs developed a hierarchical taxonomy of the beings appearing in abduction accounts based on his analysis of hundreds of cases, and at the top of this taxonomy, he placed beings who were physically distinctive, larger, more elaborately constituted, and more directly engaged with the witness's consciousness than the smaller entities who performed the bulk of the procedural work. Jacobs was careful about naming these beings, resisting the temptation to overlay cultural comparisons, but his descriptions of the upper-tier entities, their physical characteristics, their behavioral patterns, their relationship with the witness and with the other entities present, are immediately recognizable to any researcher familiar with the Mantis Being literature. One of the most important foundational cases in the specific Mantis Being literature is the experience of Jim Sparks, an American man who began reporting contact experiences in the mid-1980s and who documented them in a book published in 2006 titled The Keepers. Sparks is unusual among contact experiencers in that his encounters were largely conscious, not recovered under hypnosis, but experienced in waking awareness, and he reported a series of encounters over many years that he described as progressively revealing. Among the beings who appeared in Sparks' accounts was one that he described with language that is, in its physical specificity, unmistakably a mantis being, very tall, with a triangular head, enormous dark eyes, long jointed arms, and a quality of presence that Sparks described as the most ancient thing I've ever been near. The being communicated with Sparks in what he described as a direct mental transmission, not telepathy in the science fiction sense, but something more immediate and overwhelming than that, a transmission of meaning that arrived fully formed in his consciousness without the mediation of language. And the being communicated, according to Sparks, over a period of years, a message about the relationship between the contact phenomenon and the future of Earth's biosphere, a message that Sparks found both compelling and deeply disturbing. The case of Linda Porter, documented by researcher Virginia Aronson and later by Michael Lindemann, is another foundational text in the specific mantis being literature. Porter, a California woman who began recovering memories of contact experiences in the 1980s, described encounters with beings that she eventually came to call the Doctors. Tall, insect-like beings who appeared to be overseeing a program of physical and psychological examination that had been ongoing since her childhood. Porter's descriptions of these beings are detailed, specific, and consistent over time, and they match the mantis template in all its essential elements. What makes the Porter case particularly significant is the quality of the communication she describes. A sustained, coherent, multi-decade relationship with beings who communicated with her in a way that went beyond the clinical and the procedural into something that she could only describe as educational, as though she were being taught something, as though the encounters were not merely about taking from her, but about giving to her, about preparing her for something that required a different kind of understanding than the one she arrived in life with. The Catherine Howard case, documented by researcher Robert Shapiro, provides another early and detailed mantis encounter description from the same period. Howard, a professional woman in the American Southwest with no prior interest in UFO phenomena, began experiencing what she described as intrusions in the night. Presences in her bedroom that she initially attributed to sleep paralysis or hypnagogic hallucination, until the detail and the internal consistency of the experiences became impossible to dismiss on those terms. Among the beings she eventually described was one that she characterized with an intensity and a certainty that distinguished her description from the surrounding uncertainty of other aspects of her experience. This being was tall. She estimated between 7 and 8 feet. Its head was unlike anything human, triangular, with a protruding quality at the upper cranium and a narrowness at the lower face that made her think, immediately and involuntarily, of a praying mantis. Its eyes were dark and enormous, and when it looked at her, she felt opened, as she put it, as though the gaze of the being had somehow passed through the surface of her awareness and was reading something deeper. The being never spoke. It communicated. And what it communicated was not words, but something that felt like absolute certainty about things she had no rational basis for being certain about. These early foundational cases share not merely the physical description of the mantis being, but the quality of the experience it generates, and that quality is one of the most important data points in the entire literature. The mantis being does not merely appear and depart. Its presence does something to the witness, something that persists, something that reorganizes the witness's sense of self, of reality, of their place in a cosmos that, after the encounter, seems very much larger and stranger and more intentional than it did before. This transformation is reported so consistently across the foundational cases that it has to be treated as one of the defining characteristics of the mantis encounter. Not a side effect, not a symptom, but a feature, something that is, perhaps, the point. The Australian case literature adds a dimension to the foundational history that is important for its geographic independence and for the cultural context in which it occurs. Australia has its own rich and largely independent tradition of contact experience documentation. developed through the work of researchers like Bill Chalker, Mary Rodwell, and others who worked largely without reference to the American research community and who consequently provide a particularly valuable independent data set. Within this Australian literature, mantis being descriptions appear with the same essential characteristics as their Northern Hemisphere counterparts. The height, the geometry of the head, the nature of the eyes, the quality of presence, the mode of communication, all present, all consistent. Australian witnesses who describe these beings are, in the majority of cases, people who have had no exposure to the American abduction literature and who bring to their descriptions a cultural context. Indigenous Australian cosmology, the specific relationship of Australian culture with the concept of alien presence, that is markedly different from the North American context. The consistency of the description across this cultural difference is precisely the kind of evidence that researchers who are trying to distinguish genuine experiential reports from culturally mediated ones find most compelling. One of the most significant Australian foundational cases involves a witness identified in the literature as Peter Corey, who reported a series of unusual experiences beginning in the late 1980s and continuing through the 1990s. Corey's experiences included an encounter in which two beings appeared in his bedroom, one of them a tall, insect-like figure with characteristics consistent with the mantis being description, and which left him with both vivid conscious recollection and a small piece of physical evidence, a strand of biological material that was subsequently subjected to DNA analysis by a team including Bill Chalker. The DNA results were anomalous in ways that researchers found interesting, though the chain of custody and the methodology of the analysis have been subject to critique. The encounter itself, however, the description of the tall, insect-like being, its physical characteristics, its mode of presence, adds a detailed and independently gathered account to the foundational literature. The work of Dolores Cannon, the American hypnotherapist who worked with contact experiencers for over 4 decades before her death in 2014, provides another substantial layer of foundational case material. Cannon's approach to regression hypnosis was distinctive. She developed her own method, which she called quantum healing hypnosis technique, and she gathered a vast number of accounts from clients who described a wide range of extraordinary experiences. Within this vast material, mantis being descriptions appear with notable frequency, and they are consistent with the broader literature in their physical characteristics while adding some details that are particularly interesting. Cannon's subjects frequently describe the mantis beings as teachers, beings who use the encounter not primarily for physical examination or collection, but for the transmission of information and perspective. They described learning things in the presence of the mantis being that they could not fully articulate upon return to ordinary consciousness, but that left a residue of expanded understanding, a sense of having been temporarily in contact with a perspective on reality that was vastly broader and deeper than anything available in ordinary human experience. This educational or transmissive quality of the mantis encounter is one of the themes that will recur throughout this exploration. It distinguishes the mantis encounter in important ways from the more clinically focused accounts that characterize much of the gray entity literature. The grays, in the majority of accounts, are functional. They perform procedures, they collect samples, they operate equipment. The mantis beings are communicative in a deeper sense. They transmit, they teach, they reorganize, and the things they transmit and teach, whatever they are, appear to have lasting effects on the consciousness and the life trajectories of those who receive them. The foundational literature of the mantis being phenomenon spans roughly 3 decades and multiple continents. It was gathered by independent researchers using different methods from witnesses who had no contact with each other in cultural contexts that share no relevant mythology about insectoid beings of extraordinary intelligence and authority. The consistency of the core description, physical, behavioral, and experiential, across this foundation is the basis for everything that follows. It is not proof. Nothing in this field, at its current state of development, constitutes proof in the strict scientific sense. But it is a foundation. It is the beginning of a map, and a map of a territory, even an incomplete and imperfect map, is more useful than the refusal to acknowledge that the territory exists. The architecture of encounter. How mantis contact happens. If you were to construct, from the accumulated testimony of thousands of witnesses, a composite description of how a Mantis being encounter begins, unfolds, and ends, what you would produce is something with a recognizable structure, not a rigid template, but a set of recurring elements and sequences that appear in varying combinations and orders across the full breadth of the documented literature. This structure is one of the most important arguments for the reality of the phenomenon, because it suggests that what witnesses are reporting is not a random or individually determined experience, but something that has an objective form, something that happens rather than something that is imagined. The beginning of a Mantis encounter most commonly occurs at night in a domestic setting. The witness is in their bedroom, often in the process of falling asleep or just having woken. The first indication that something unusual is about to happen is typically described as an environmental change, a shift in the quality of the light, a change in the atmosphere of the room, a sound or vibration that is unusual and that the body responds to before the conscious mind has processed it. Some witnesses describe a blue or white light that begins at the perimeter of the room and moves, or that seems to come from a location that cannot be identified. Others describe a high-pitched sound or a low vibration that is felt in the chest and the bones rather than heard with the ears. A number of witnesses describe the first indication as being a smell, something unusual, often described as ozone-like or metallic or organic in a way that has no comfortable domestic reference point. The physiological response to these environmental cues is itself distinctive and consistently reported. The witness experiences what can only be described as a neurological shift, a sudden and involuntary alteration of their normal state of consciousness that is different from falling asleep, different from the onset of a seizure, and different from any drug-induced alteration they may have experienced. It is described as a simultaneous calming and intensifying, a paradoxical state in which the body becomes very still and the mind becomes very alert. Some witnesses describe a paralysis, the classic sleep paralysis that is frequently invoked by skeptics as the explanation for the entire phenomenon. But witness after witness describes the paralysis of these experiences as qualitatively different from sleep paralysis, different in how it feels, in how it arrives, in what accompanies it, and in what follows it. Sleep paralysis is not typically followed by hours of complex experience that leave lasting physiological and psychological effects. The paralysis of the Mantis encounter is. After the environmental changes and the neurological shift, the being appears. Sometimes this appearance is gradual, a form coalescing out of the light or the darkness of the room, a presence felt before it is seen, a shape that the eye takes a moment to resolve into a figure. Sometimes it is sudden. The witness blinks, or the light shifts, and the being is simply there, in the room, in a way that implies an arrival that did not require a door or a window. Some witnesses describe the being as passing through a wall or a ceiling, not metaphorically, but as a literal description of a physical entity moving through a solid, structural boundary in a way that should be impossible, and that, in the witness's account, appears to be trivially easy for the being. Others describe a craft. The witness finds themselves, without a clear transition, on board something that is not the room they were in the presence of beings that include the Mantis entity. The transition from domestic setting to craft setting is one of the most disorienting aspects of the encounter, and witnesses describe it in terms that suggest an alteration of their physical location that occurs through a mechanism they cannot observe or account for. The entry of the Mantis being into the encounter space, wherever that space is, changes everything about the encounter's texture. Witnesses who have described other entities in the encounter space before the Mantis arrived consistently note that the Mantis's arrival changes the atmosphere of the space in a way that is immediately and physically perceptible. The other entities orient toward the Mantis. They may move aside. They may adopt postures that witnesses read as deferential. The overall quality of the encounter, which may, up to this point, have been clinical and impersonal, shifts towards something more personally directed. The Mantis being, upon entering, typically orients toward the witness, specifically, directly, and with an intensity of attention that witnesses find overwhelming. The communication that follows, and there is almost always communication in Mantis encounters, unlike the more purely procedural gray entity encounters, is one of the most consistently described and most consistently remarkable aspects of the experience. Witnesses are unanimous on one point. The mantis being does not speak in any conventional sense. There is no sound produced by the being's body or any device it carries that corresponds to speech. And yet the witness receives information, structured, coherent, often complex information, in a way that feels direct and immediate. The most common description is of thoughts or concepts or entire knowledge structures that arrive in the witness's awareness already formed, already understood, without the intermediate step of decoding language. Witnesses describe this as being shown rather than told, as though the information is transmitted not symbolically, but directly as experience rather than as description. The content of these transmissions varies enormously across accounts, but certain themes recur with enough frequency to be considered characteristic. The nature of the universe, its scale, its age, its organization, the history of life on Earth, a history that, in these transmissions, extends further back and is more complicated than conventional science acknowledges. The nature of the human species and its place in a larger community of intelligent life, a community that is, in these accounts, much larger and much more organized than most humans suspect. The current state of the Earth's biosphere and the trajectory of human activity in relation to it, a subject that, in virtually all mantis communications, carries a weight of urgency that witnesses find deeply disturbing, and the nature of consciousness itself, its relationship with the physical body, its continuity beyond individual death, its participation in structures and processes that exceed any framework conventional human philosophy or religion has constructed. These are large topics. They are the topics that human civilization has been struggling with for millennia, and the fact that encounters with mantis beings consistently produce, in witnesses, a sense of having received meaningful transmissions about these specific topics is itself a data point of extraordinary significance. Whether those transmissions correspond to anything true, whether they are accurate accounts of reality or sophisticated constructions designed to produce specific effects in the witness's psychology, is a question that the field has not been able to answer with any confidence. But the consistency of the thematic content of mantis transmissions across the full breadth of the independent witness literature is as significant as the consistency of the physical descriptions. Something is being communicated, the same things in different ways to different people in different places over many decades. The possibility that this represents a genuine information transfer relationship between the mantis beings and the human species is one that researchers cannot responsibly ignore. The physical examination component of mantis encounters is typically less central than in gray entity encounters, but it is not absent. In many accounts, there is a physical examination. The witness is on a surface of some kind in a prone position, and beings perform what witnesses describe as medical or biological examination. In encounters where a mantis being is present, it typically does not perform this examination itself. That function, in the hierarchical division of the encounter's labor, is performed by the smaller entities. The mantis being watches or oversees or communicates with the witness while the examination is conducted. In some accounts, the mantis being places one of its long hands on the witness's head, at the forehead, or at the back of the skull, in a gesture that witnesses consistently describe as having an effect. The effect is described variously as a flooding of warmth or light or information, as a momentary dissolution of the normal sense of self, as a sudden and overwhelming expansion of awareness beyond the normal boundaries of individual consciousness. Whatever the physical mechanism, if there is one that can be described in those terms, the effect is real, in the sense that it is experienced, that it persists beyond the encounter, and that it produces verifiable changes in the witness's psychology, beliefs, and behavior. The witness's emotional experience during the encounter is complex and varies considerably across accounts and across the duration of any single encounter. The predominant initial emotion is fear, a raw, biological fear that is independent of any cognitive assessment of the situation, and that is experienced before the witness has had time to process what is happening. This fear is understandable and expected. The the encounter represents, on every level that the human threat response system is calibrated to respond to, an extreme violation of boundaries. Physical intrusion into the most intimate domestic space, loss of physical autonomy, contact with something that is profoundly, unmistakably non-human. The fear response is appropriate and is experienced whether or not the witness has prior context for understanding what is happening to them. But the fear response in mantis encounters is typically modified, often quite rapidly, by something that the mantis being appears to do deliberately. Witnesses describe the being exerting some kind of calming influence, not through any verbal reassurance and not through any physical restraint, but through something that feels, to the witness, like a direct intervention in their neurological state. The fear does not disappear, but it becomes manageable. It is overlaid by something else, a forced calm, a compelled stillness that witnesses often describe as not entirely pleasant because it has a quality of imposition rather than invitation. The being is not making them feel better because it cares about their comfort. It is modulating their neurological state because a certain level of calm in the witness is necessary for the encounter to proceed as the being intends. This distinction between genuine comfort and imposed calm is one that witnesses make consistently and explicitly, and it is one of the details that argues most strongly against a simple wishful thinking interpretation of the experience. As the encounter progresses, and particularly after the initial fear response has been managed, witnesses typically report a gradual shift in their emotional state towards something more complex. Awe is the word that appears most frequently, not the comfortable awe of a beautiful sunset, but the deep, destabilizing awe of confrontation with something so much larger than the self that the normal coordinates of identity and understanding temporarily fail. Some witnesses report what they describe as love, not the warm, interpersonal love of human relationship, but something they can only describe as a cosmic quality of recognition, as though the being looking at them recognizes something in them that they themselves have forgotten or never fully known. Others report grief, an inexplicable, overwhelming grief that has no identified object, that seems to come from nowhere and to mean everything. These complex emotional textures of the mantis encounter are among its most distinctive features, and they are precisely the kind of thing that makes the experience impossible to categorize under any simple framework. The end of the encounter is, in many cases, as abrupt and as disorienting as the beginning. The witness finds themselves back in their domestic setting, in their bedroom, on their bed, with the being or beings gone. The environmental quality of the room has returned to normal. The clock shows a time that may be consistent with the duration the witness experienced, or may show a discrepancy, more time having passed than the subjective experience of the encounter should account for. The witness is left with a collection of fragmentary memories, some vivid and some vague, a set of physical sensations, fatigue, unusual body marks or sensations, a residual sense of presence that fades slowly, and a cognitive and emotional landscape that has been fundamentally altered. The aftermath of a mantis encounter is as important to document as the encounter itself, because it reveals something about what the encounter actually does at the deepest level to those who have it. The most consistent immediate aftermath is what witnesses describe as a sense of having been given something, not taken from, which is the dominant framework of the more clinical gray entity encounters, but given to. Given information, given perspective, given, in some accounts, an explicit mission or task whose terms they can feel even if they cannot fully articulate them. This sense of assignment, of having been enlisted, however involuntarily, in something larger than their individual life, is one of the most characteristic and most consequential features of the mantis encounter. Over the longer term, witnesses report changes that are both psychological and behavioral. Changes in their interests, sometimes dramatic, sudden and overwhelming new passions for fields of knowledge that they had previously ignored, particularly in areas related to biology, cosmology, consciousness, and ecology. Changes in their relationships with other people, a new difficulty in tolerating superficiality, a new intensity of empathy, sometimes an isolation born of carrying an experience and a knowledge that cannot be shared in ordinary social contexts. Changes in their relationship with the natural world, an intensification of awareness of the non-human environment, of plants, animals, ecosystems, that witnesses often describe as having a quality of listening, as though they are attending to something the world is saying, and changes in their experience of time, a persistent and often quite difficult alteration of the normal sense of temporal flow, a feeling that time works differently than it did before the encounter, that the present moment is denser and the future more visible in some way that cannot be fully specified. These post-encounter changes are not the changes that a traumatized person typically exhibits, though there are genuine traumatic elements in many accounts, and it would be dishonest to minimize them. They are the changes of someone who has been exposed to something that genuinely, substantively altered their model of reality, not someone who dreamed something disturbing and cannot shake it, someone who experienced something real that revealed to them things about the structure of the world that they did not previously know and that they now cannot unknow. The clinical literature of post-traumatic stress describes a specific set of changes in consciousness following traumatic experience. The changes reported by Mantis encounter witnesses are partly overlapping with this literature, but partly quite distinct from it, and the distinctions are as significant as the overlaps. One of the most important structural features of the Mantis encounter phenomenon, observed across many years of case accumulation, is its tendency toward recurrence. First encounters are rarely last encounters. Witnesses who have one encounter with a mantis being almost universally report subsequent contact, not always as dramatic or as physically intense as the first, but continuous in some form. Some witnesses describe a relationship that has continued for decades. Others describe a pattern of contact that appears to correlate with specific life events or developmental thresholds. Still others describe contact that was intensive during certain periods of their life and then apparently ceased, without explanation, at some point that they can identify but not fully interpret. The recurring nature of mantis contact suggests an ongoing relationship, one that is directed and intentional on the being's side, even if it feels involuntary and disorienting on the witness's side. Something is being pursued, something is being tracked or monitored or cultivated. The longitudinal nature of the relationship is one of the most important clues to the nature and the purpose of the whole enterprise. The hierarchy of the cosmos, organizational structure and command. One of the most structurally significant features of the mantis being phenomenon is not anything about the beings themselves in isolation. It is the relationship between the mantis beings and the other entities that appear alongside them. Because if you survey the complete body of the documented literature, the hypnotic regression transcripts, the conscious recall accounts, the detailed case files of researchers spanning 4 decades, what you find is not a collection of independent, randomly assorted entities doing independent things. What you find is an organization, a structure, a system with what appears to be a clear internal hierarchy, consistent role differentiation, and coordinated function. And at or near the top of that hierarchy, with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence or cultural contamination, sits the mantis being. To understand what this means, you have to understand the full spectrum of what the contact literature documents. The small gray beings, 3 to 4 feet tall, with large heads, enormous black eyes, and the slight mechanical bodies that have made them the dominant symbol of alien contact in popular culture, are the most commonly reported entities in the abduction literature. They are the workhorses of the phenomenon. They appear in the largest numbers. They perform the most visible, most procedurally specific tasks: the examinations, the collections, the transportation of witnesses from one location to another. They operate equipment. They move through encounter spaces with a purposeful efficiency that witnesses consistently describe as clinical, impersonal, and functionally oriented. In the accounts that feature only grays, no mantis, no other entity type, the encounter has a certain quality. It is intrusive and often frightening, but it is, in a sense, mechanical. Something is being done. Something is being taken or measured or collected. The grays do what they do with the focused efficiency of specialists, and the encounter has the quality of a medical procedure, unpleasant, disorienting, apparently purposeful, but without any deep engagement with the witness as a thinking, feeling, conscious being. When the Mantis being enters the account, either arriving during an encounter that was already underway with smaller entities, or being present from the beginning of an encounter that takes place in a space that clearly serves a different function than the examination rooms of most gray entity accounts, everything changes. The grays respond to the Mantis being's presence. In accounts where witnesses have observed the behavior of both entity types in the same space, the testimony on this point is remarkably consistent. The grays defer to the Mantis being. They orient toward it. They move out of its way. They hold still in its presence in a way that differs from their normal, constantly purposeful movement. Some witnesses have observed what they interpret as communication between the Mantis being and the gray entities, a transmission that is not observed directly, but whose effects are immediately visible in the gray's subsequent behavior. The Mantis being apparently gives direction, the grays receive it, and the direction is followed. The hierarchy is not merely suggested by the being's physical arrangement in the space, it is demonstrated repeatedly and consistently in the observable dynamics of their interaction. This hierarchical organization raises a set of questions that are among the most important in the entire field of contact research. What does it mean for there to be a hierarchy? What does it imply about the nature of the phenomenon as a whole? About whether what is being witnessed is something more like a governmental or military operation with command structures and differentiated roles than the random activity of independent beings? What does it suggest about the Mantis beings specifically? About their status, their function, their relationship to whatever overarching purpose or program the phenomenon may represent? David Jacobs, over the course of his long research career, developed what he called a secondary and tertiary entity model, a framework in which the small gray beings were the primary workforce. A middle tier of taller, more humanoid entities served a supervisory function over the grays, and at the apex of the observable hierarchy sat beings whose physical description and behavioral characteristics aligned most closely with what other researchers were calling the Mantis type. Jacobs was careful not to speculate beyond what his case material could support, but the structural conclusions he drew from his analysis of hundreds of cases were clear. The contact phenomenon is organized, it operates according to a hierarchy, and the beings at the top of that hierarchy are the ones that witnesses consistently describe as most powerful, most ancient, most directly engaged with the witness's consciousness, and most explicitly communicative about purpose and meaning. The question of what exactly constitutes the middle tier of this hierarchy is itself interesting and complex. In a significant number of accounts, between the small grays and the Mantis beings, there appear beings that researchers have described in various ways. Taller grays, sometimes called supervisory grays, beings with a more elaborately humanoid appearance than the standard gray entity, beings described as wearing uniforms or garments that suggest a military or professional role. These middle-tier beings serve, in the accounts where they appear, as intermediaries. They manage the grays, they process information from the examinations, and they appear to be in communication with the Mantis beings above them. They are, in the organizational analogy that inevitably suggests itself, middle management, receiving direction from above, directing those below, and serving a coordinative function that holds the structure of the operation together. What the operation is, what its ultimate purpose is, what it is trying to accomplish, is the question that lies at the center of everything. It is a question that the Mantis beings themselves appear to address in their communications with witnesses, but in ways that are simultaneously illuminating and deliberately or structurally incomplete. The answer is always larger than the asking. The purpose is always described in terms that the witness finds overwhelming in their scope and difficult to translate into the categories available in ordinary human discourse. The purpose involves the Earth and the humans on it, and the biosphere and time, vast stretches of time that make human history look like an eye blink. The purpose involves the nature of consciousness and its relationship with matter. The purpose involves something that witnesses describe variously as an experiment, a program, a project, or a stewardship, an ongoing, long-term engagement with the human species and its planet that the Mantis beings appear to regard as their responsibility, or their assignment, or simply what they do. The concept of stewardship, of a long-term, intentional engagement with the development of a species or a biosphere, is one that appears in Mantis communications with sufficient frequency to be considered a core theme. Witnesses describe being shown, or being given an understanding of, a relationship between the Mantis beings and humanity that extends back far further than any human historical record, back to periods that correspond, in some accounts, to the earliest phases of human evolution, and in others to something even earlier than that. The beings are described as having been present at, and in some cases as having participated in or influenced, key moments in the development of the human species and the organization of human civilization. Whether this is literally true, whether there is a genuine, ancient, multi-millennial engagement between these beings and humanity, is not something that the witness accounts alone can establish. But the claim itself, appearing consistently across independent accounts, is a datum of the most extraordinary significance. The organizational structure of the contact phenomenon, as it can be reconstructed from the accumulated witness literature, has implications that extend beyond the question of who does what in an encounter scenario. It implies something about the nature of the beings involved. Hierarchical organizations are not found in nature among entities that are not socially organized, cognitively complex, and operating under some form of shared purpose. The existence of a hierarchy implies the existence of purpose, something that the hierarchy is organized to accomplish, and the nature of the purpose that Mantis beings communicate to witnesses, its scale, its time depth, its apparent concern with the trajectory of biological life on Earth, implies a degree of intentionality and foresight that is, to say the least, extraordinary. Some researchers have approached the hierarchical structure from a different angle, asking not about its implications for the being's nature, but about its implications for the witness's safety. If there is a hierarchy, and if the Mantis beings are at or near the top of it, then understanding the nature and the intentions of the Mantis beings is, effectively, understanding the nature and intentions of the phenomenon as a whole. The grays in this model are instruments, important instruments perhaps, but instruments nonetheless. The decision-making, the purpose, the agenda, these belong to the level of the hierarchy that the Mantis beings occupy. This is a sobering conclusion. It means that in trying to understand what is happening in the contact phenomenon, what it means for humanity, what its implications are, the small gray beings that dominate the cultural image of alien contact are, in a sense, the wrong place to look. The grays are the visible face of an operation whose command is held elsewhere by something larger, older, and more consequent. The relationship between the Mantis beings and the beings who occupy the middle tier of the hierarchy is also illuminating. A number of researchers have noted that some of the taller, more humanoid entities that serve as intermediaries in the contact hierarchy appear to have a relationship with the Mantis beings that is not merely functional. Some witnesses describe what appears to be a genuine communicative relationship, one in which the Mantis being engages with the taller humanoid in a way that has more of the quality of a collegial exchange than a simple command structure. Some witnesses describe the Mantis being as appearing to instruct or teach these entities, not in the peremptory way of an authority figure directing subordinates, but in the more engaged way of a mentor or educator. If this observation is accurate, it suggests that the relationship between the Mantis beings and the other entities in the hierarchy may be one of age as much as authority. The Mantis beings may be older, more developed, more experienced, and the other entities may be in some kind of developmental relationship with them that goes beyond simple command and obedience. This interpretation is supported by the quality of the Mantis being's communications with human witnesses. When a Mantis being communicates with a witness, it is consistently described as communicating in a way that is organized, patient, and structured for comprehension. It is not transmitting raw data, it is transmitting meaning, organized, considered, calibrated to the recipient's capacity to receive it. This calibration implies an understanding of the recipient's nature and limitations, and it implies an intentionality in the communication that is more characteristic of a teacher or a guide than of a data collection device. The Mantis being, in its communications with human witnesses, appears to be doing something deliberate, attempting to bring the witness to an understanding that they do not yet have, using methods that are suited to that purpose. This is not the behavior of a being that regards humans as simply an interesting biological sample. This is the behavior of a being that regards humans as having a potential that is worth the effort of development. The concept of the mantis being as educator or guide is one that many witnesses embrace, in retrospect, as the most accurate description of their experience. The initial encounter, frightening, invasive, overwhelming, does not, in this retrospective understanding, tell the whole story. What the encounter initiated, the process of change and growth and expanded understanding that follows, is the larger story. And in that larger story, the mantis being appears not as an oppressor or an intruder, but as something more complex, an agent of transformation operating with an authority that comes from knowledge and age rather than from domination, pursuing a purpose that is, from the human perspective, not entirely comfortable, but that is, from the perspective that the encounters themselves appear to be cultivating, something that makes a different kind of sense. The question of whether this interpretation, the mantis as guide and educator pursuing humanity's development rather than its exploitation, is accurate is one that the field debates with considerable vigor. There are researchers who find this interpretation naive, who read the hierarchical structure and the involuntary nature of the encounters as evidence of something far less benevolent. There are witnesses who agree, who describe their encounters not as transformative, but as violating, and who resist any retrospective reframing that would soften the coercive quality of what they experienced. These dissenting perspectives are important and honest, and we will address them in full. The truth about the mantis being's intentions, to the extent that any truth about it can be established, is almost certainly more complex than either the benevolent guide model or the malevolent exploiter model can fully accommodate. What is clear is that the beings are organized, intentional, and operating toward a purpose. What that purpose is, and whether it is one that serves human interests in any meaningful sense, is the deepest and most important open question of the entire field. The military and intelligence community's engagement with the contact phenomenon adds another dimension to the question of organizational structure that is worth noting in this context. A number of witnesses and researchers operating in and around the margins of governmental intelligence communities have suggested that the hierarchical structure of the contact phenomenon is not entirely non-human in its composition, that elements of human governmental and military organizations have, over a period of decades, established working relationships with certain levels of the non-human hierarchy, and that these relationships have produced information-sharing arrangements and technological transfers whose nature and extent remain almost entirely hidden from public view. The evidence for these claims is difficult to evaluate. It is, almost by definition, the kind of evidence that is most thoroughly insulated from public verification. But the pattern of testimony from individuals with relevant background, the behavior of governmental institutions toward the phenomenon, and the documented history of official engagement with it provide a circumstantial case that is more substantial than mainstream commentary typically acknowledges. If these claims have any basis, if there is a genuine, ongoing relationship between elements of the human governmental structure and the hierarchical organization of the contact phenomenon, then the question of where the mantis beings fit in that relationship is one of enormous consequence. Are the mantis beings the ultimate interlocutors, the beings with whom any human governmental engagement must ultimately reckon? Are they aware of and party to whatever arrangements may exist at lower levels of the hierarchy? Do they regard those arrangements with approval, with indifference, or with something else? The witness literature does not provide clear answers to these questions, but it does consistently describe the mantis beings as aware of human governmental and institutional structures, and as regarding them with something that witnesses interpret as a kind of patient, cosmic amusement. The equanimity of a being that has watched the rise and fall of civilizations and regards the current configuration of human institutional power as an interesting but ultimately temporary arrangement. The organizational structure of the contact phenomenon is not merely an academic question. It has practical implications for how humanity should think about the phenomenon and how it should approach it. If what is operating is an organized hierarchy, directed, purposeful, and operating on a timescale and at a level of complexity that far exceeds anything in the human institutional playbook, then the response of denial and containment that has characterized official engagement with the phenomenon for most of the past century is not merely intellectually dishonest, it is strategically inadequate to the reality it is trying to manage. A phenomenon that operates at the level and the scale that the contact literature suggests cannot be managed by denial. It can only be engaged. And engagement with something this large and this organized and this apparently ancient requires a quality of understanding and a depth of intellectual honesty that the institutions responsible for the management of human affairs have not, until very recently, demonstrated any willingness to develop. The Mantis Beings, in their communications with witnesses, are consistently described as patient, extraordinarily patient. Patient in a way that implies a relationship with time that is fundamentally different from the human one. They are waiting for something. They are moving toward something. They have been moving toward it for longer than any individual human witness can fully comprehend, and they will continue moving toward it regardless of whether any particular human institution chooses to acknowledge or engage with what they represent. This patience is, depending on your perspective, either deeply reassuring or deeply unsettling. It is reassuring if it implies that the Mantis Beings regard the current phase of human confusion and institutional denial as a temporary condition that will pass. It is unsettling if it implies that whatever they are moving toward will arrive, whether or not humanity has had the opportunity to understand and consent to it. The question of consent, of whether the contact phenomenon, with all its involuntary and coercive dimensions, can be understood in a framework that includes human agency and choice, is one that runs through the entire body of the literature and that we will address at length. For now, in the context of the organizational structure, it is enough to note that the hierarchy appears to have a purpose. The Mantis Beings appear to be central to that purpose, and the purpose appears to involve the human species in a way that is simultaneously flattering and alarming. We are, in this model, not incidental to what the Mantis Beings are doing. We are, apparently, what they are doing it to, or with, or for. And the difference between those prepositions, to, with, for, is perhaps the most important question of all. The language of minds, communication, transmission, and cognitive impact. The question of how the Mantis Beings communicate is inseparable from the question of what they communicate, because the method is part of the message. When a being transmits meaning to a human consciousness not through sound and symbol, not through the evolved technology of language that has been the medium of human thought and culture for 100,000 years, but through something more direct, something that places structured understanding in the witness's awareness without any of the intermediate steps that language requires. The implications go far beyond the simple transfer of information. They go to the nature of consciousness itself. They go to what minds are, and what the relationship between minds can be, and what is possible when the conventional barriers between one awareness and another are, apparently, temporarily removed. Every witness who has described direct communication with a mantis being converges on the same fundamental point. It is not telepathy in any science fiction sense. It is not hearing a voice inside your head. It is not receiving a message in your own language that seems to come from outside. It is something that witnesses, reaching for language to describe a process that language itself is inadequate to convey, typically describe as direct knowing. Meaning arrives already assembled. Concepts arrive already understood. Sometimes witnesses describe receiving not just propositional content, not just facts or ideas, but entire experiential states, memories that are not their own, perceptions from spatial and temporal vantage points that are not their own, emotional states that carry their own intrinsic content in the way that a felt experience carries its own content, rather than the way a description of an experience does. The mantis being, in these accounts, does not describe a thing, it shows it, and the showing happens at a level of directness that bypasses every intermediate step in the normal processing of meaning. This mode of communication has been described and analyzed by researchers in various ways. Some frame it in terms of quantum entanglement. the non-local correlations between quantum states that physics has confirmed and that some theorists have proposed as the physical substrate of consciousness. Others frame it in terms of morphic resonance, Rupert Sheldrake's controversial but interesting concept of a field-based information storage and transmission system that operates across biological organisms. Others take a more phenomenological approach, simply describing what witnesses report without attempting to ground it in any physical theory. What all of these approaches acknowledge is that the communication mode of the Mantis Beings, as described by witnesses, implies a model of consciousness that is radically different from the one that dominates contemporary neuroscience. A model in which consciousness is not a product of individual brain activity, but something more like a field that individual brains participate in and that can, under certain conditions, be accessed directly by other minds without the mediation of physical signal. The cognitive impact of Mantis communication on witnesses is one of the most documented and most consequential aspects of the entire phenomenon. Witnesses who have received transmissions from Mantis beings consistently report changes to their cognitive function that persist well beyond the encounter itself. The changes are not the blunted, confused cognition of post-traumatic stress, though stress responses are certainly part of the picture. They are, in a significant proportion of cases, changes that witnesses describe in essentially positive terms: enhanced perception, expanded capacity for simultaneous processing of complex information, a new facility for pattern recognition that they describe as qualitatively different from anything they experienced before the encounter. Some witnesses describe what amounts to a sudden competence in technical fields they had no prior training in, not a vague impression of knowing things, but a specific, testable, demonstrable competence that they cannot account for through any normal process of learning or development. This phenomenon, the transfer of knowledge or capability through the Mantis communication process, is one of the most extraordinary claims in the entire literature, and it is also one of the most difficult to evaluate. It is difficult to evaluate because the knowledge or capability that witnesses report having received is typically not of a kind that can be immediately and obviously verified or falsified. Witnesses describe knowing things about physics or biology or the structure of the cosmos or the nature of consciousness that feel completely certain and completely real, but that they cannot fully articulate in ways that allow for external assessment. The knowledge feels complete inside the experience of knowing it. The translation of that inner knowing into external, testable claims is where the difficulty arises. There are, however, a number of cases in the literature where the knowledge or capability apparently transferred through Mantis communication has had verifiable and specific outcomes. Cases where witnesses have subsequently demonstrated unusual competence in technical or artistic fields that they had no prior experience with. Cases where information apparently received in the encounter has been subsequently confirmed through independent channels. Cases where the specific content of Mantis transmissions about the state of the Earth's biosphere, about the direction of human civilization, about specific events or developments, has been shown over time to have been accurate. These verifiable cases are fewer and more difficult to assess than the broader phenomenological literature, but they exist, and they deserve the same serious engagement that the rest of the case material does. One of the most interesting aspects of the Mantis communication mode is what researchers have called the layered quality of the information transmitted. Witnesses frequently describe receiving information in a Mantis encounter that they understand initially at one level, and that they continue to understand more deeply in new and expanded ways as time passes after the encounter. The transmission, in other words, is not a simple package of data that is either understood or not. It appears to be structured in layers of complexity, each of which becomes accessible to the witness at a different stage of their subsequent development. Some witnesses describe insights arriving, sometimes years after the initial encounter, that they immediately recognize as belonging to the original transmission, becoming understandable at a depth that was not available to them at the time of the encounter itself. This layered quality implies a sophistication in the design of the communication that goes well beyond anything in the human communications technology repertoire. Whoever or whatever is designing these transmissions is doing so with an understanding of the recipient's developmental trajectory that implies an extraordinary depth of knowledge about human psychological and cognitive development. The emotional content of Mantis transmissions is as significant as the intellectual content, and the two are not easily separable in the way that human communication typically separates feeling from information. When a Mantis being transmits a concept about the age of the universe, that concept arrives in the witness's awareness, accompanied by an emotional quality that is intrinsic to the concept itself. A felt sense of that age that is not an interpretation added by the witness, but a component of what was transmitted. When it transmits something about the current state of the Earth's biosphere, the information arrives with an emotional weight, described variously as grief, urgency, love, or a peculiar mixture of all three that witnesses find overwhelming and that they consistently report as the most difficult part of the transmission to carry back into ordinary life. The emotion is not incidental, it is structural, it is part of the meaning. This integration of emotion and information in Mantis communication is itself deeply significant, and it challenges one of the dominant assumptions of Western culture about the nature of knowledge, the assumption that objective knowledge is emotionally neutral, that the feeling one has about a fact is separate from and irrelevant to the factual content itself. The Mantis communication mode, as described by witnesses, suggests a fundamentally different model, one in which feeling and knowing are not separate faculties but aspects of a single faculty, and in which the full understanding of any significant reality includes an emotional component that is as essential as the propositional content. This is not a new idea in human philosophy. It has deep roots in both Eastern thought and in the Western phenomenological tradition, but its appearance as a practical feature of an apparently non-human communication technology is both arresting and thought-provoking. The specific content themes of Mantis communications deserve individual treatment because they form a coherent picture when examined in aggregate, a picture whose internal consistency is itself significant. The most universal theme, appearing in virtually every account where Mantis beings communicate substantively with witnesses, is what researchers have come to call the ecological message. The beings communicate with an urgency and a specificity that witnesses find deeply disturbing about the state of the Earth's biosphere. They communicate about the acceleration of extinction rates, about the disruption of ecological systems that have maintained life on Earth for hundreds of millions of years, about the trajectory of human industrial activity and its relationship to the continuity of complex life on the planet. This communication is not abstract environmental generality. It is, in many accounts, painfully specific. Witnesses describe being shown images or experiencing direct perceptual simulations of environmental collapse that are detailed and visceral in ways that haunt them for years. The ecological message, as delivered by the Mantis beings across decades of independent accounts, is consistent not only in its concern, but in its specificity. There is a threshold, a point of no return, and the human species is approaching it with an urgency of the wrong kind, the urgency of acceleration rather than correction. The second major communication theme is what can be called the consciousness message. The Mantis beings communicate with equal consistency about the nature of human consciousness, about what it is capable of, and about the gap between current human self-understanding and the actual nature and potential of conscious awareness. The consciousness message typically involves a direct experiential component. The witness is not merely told about the nature of consciousness, but is briefly given an experience of it that goes beyond the normal parameters of individual human awareness. Witnesses describe moments of expanded consciousness in the presence of Mantis beings that they characterize as the most important experiences of their lives. Moments of awareness in which the normal boundaries of the individual self dissolved and something vastly larger was briefly felt from the inside. These moments are consistently described as revelatory in the strongest possible sense, not as insights or illuminations, but as encounters with a quality of reality that the ordinary human cognitive mode has no access to. and the Mantis Beings in these accounts appear to be providing the access deliberately, as though expanding the witness's consciousness to this level, even briefly, is itself a purpose of the encounter. The third major theme is the historical message, the communication about the actual history of intelligent life on Earth and in the cosmos. This theme is the most difficult to evaluate objectively because its claims are the most radical in their departure from established scientific understanding. Witnesses describe receiving transmissions about a history of life on Earth that is both longer and more complex than the one recorded in the standard scientific account. A history that includes earlier periods of advanced civilization, earlier phases of non-human intelligent presence on Earth, and a relationship between the Mantis Beings and the development of life and intelligence on this planet that goes back to what the beings present as a time of intentional seeding or cultivation. These claims are extraordinary. They are also internally consistent across independent accounts and across decades of research. Whether they are literally true, whether they correspond to an actual history rather than to a complex of beings who, for reasons of their own, construct a narrative of this kind in the minds of witnesses, is not something that can currently be determined. But the consistency and the specificity of the historical narrative transmitted by Mantis Beings across the full breadth of the witness literature demands a level of engagement that goes beyond dismissal. The method of transmission itself, the direct non-linguistic mode of Mantis communication, has been the subject of considerable theoretical speculation among researchers and among the broader community of people who engage seriously with these questions. Some have proposed that what is happening is a form of neurostimulation, the mantis being directly stimulating specific areas of the witness's brain in ways that produce the experience of knowing without the need for any actual information transfer. This hypothesis has the advantage of not requiring any radical revision of the current scientific understanding of consciousness, since it grounds the experience in conventional neurology. But it has the disadvantage of being unable to account for the cases in which the knowledge apparently transferred has been subsequently verified, unless the being was stimulating not just the experience of knowing, but also, somehow, the content of specific, accurate knowledge about the world. That would require the being to already possess the knowledge it was supposedly only simulating, which concedes the point about the being's nature and capability that the hypothesis was trying to avoid. Others have proposed that what is happening is something more radical, a genuine interpenetration of two consciousness systems in which the Mantis Being's awareness and the witness's awareness temporarily share a common space, allowing for the direct transfer of experiential content rather than merely symbolic content. This hypothesis requires a model of consciousness that is not currently supported by mainstream neuroscience, but that is consistent with a significant body of research in the fields of parapsychology, consciousness studies, and quantum biology. It is also, notably, the model that most closely matches what witnesses themselves describe, the feeling not of being informed, but of briefly inhabiting a larger perspective, of temporarily being more than the sum of the individual brain's normal processing. The cognitive aftermath of Mantis communication, the lasting changes to the witness's intellectual and perceptual functioning, is as significant to document as the communication itself. Research by individuals including Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo astronaut and founder of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and by subsequent investigators using his approach of treating anomalous experiences as data rather than symptoms, has suggested that contact experiences of the Mantis type produce measurable and lasting changes in the witness's electroencephalographic profile, changes that are consistent with increased activity in the areas of the brain associated with pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and the integration of emotional and cognitive processing. Whether these changes are caused by the encounter directly or are produced by the profound psychological impact of the experience on an already exceptional brain, or represent something else entirely, is an open question. but the changes are real, documented, and deserving of the serious scientific attention they have only recently begun to receive. The Mantis Beings' apparent ability to not merely communicate with human minds, but to genuinely alter them, not through suggestion or persuasion, which are the communication tools of equals, but through something more direct and more fundamental, is, when you stop and think about it, perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the entire phenomenon, if what witnesses describe is real. If the Mantis Beings genuinely possess the capacity to restructure a human being's cognitive and perceptual apparatus through what appears to be direct mind-to-mind contact, then what we are dealing with is not merely an alien species with unusual physical characteristics. We are dealing with a being that relates to consciousness in a fundamentally different way than anything in human experience or human scientific understanding can account for. We are dealing with a being for whom mind is not a product of matter, but perhaps the other way around. And if that is what the Mantis Beings are, beings for whom consciousness is primary, who have developed or represent a relationship with awareness itself that goes beyond anything the biological model of intelligence implies, then the encounter with them is not merely an encounter with an unusual life form. It is an encounter with a different order of reality, an order that has, apparently, been visiting us, studying us, communicating with us, and working on us for a very long time. Ancient architects, historical and mythological parallels. The tendency to look for the Mantis Beings in the historical and mythological record is understandable, and it is an exercise that yields results that are, at minimum, striking. Whether those results are evidence of a genuinely ancient engagement between these beings and human civilization, or whether they reflect the universality of certain geometric and symbolic forms that the human visual system is predisposed to recognize, is a question that cannot currently be resolved with certainty. But the parallels are there, they are specific, and they deserve examination. The most immediately obvious historical parallel is with the religious and cosmological traditions of ancient Egypt. The being known to the Egyptians as Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of wisdom, writing, magic, and measurement, who served as the divine scribe of the gods and the messenger between the divine and human realms, has a physical profile that, while not identical to the Mantis Being, shares certain structural characteristics: the elongated head, the association with wisdom and with the transmission of knowledge to humanity, the intermediate position between a higher divine realm and the human world. More directly relevant is the Egyptian concept of the Aku, spiritual beings associated with the circumpolar stars and with a very ancient period of divine kingship that Egyptian tradition placed at the very beginning of historical time. The Aku were described as luminous, associated with the deep sky, and as having presided over a period of civilization that preceded the historical kingdoms of Egypt. Their connection to the stars, their ancient authority, and their relationship with the transmission of knowledge to human civilization mirror themes that appear consistently in Mantis Being communications. The ancient Mesopotamian tradition contributes what may be an even more direct parallel. Among the various divine and semi-divine beings described in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, there is a category of being known as the Anunnaki, a term that has been extensively, if controversially, analyzed in recent decades by researchers arguing for its relevance to the question of non-human intelligent contact. Whatever one makes of those arguments, the Sumerian textual tradition also contains references to beings described as those who from the heavens came, with physical characteristics that some researchers have found consistent with the Mantis Being template: tall, associated with the deep sky rather than the planetary realm, appearing at intervals over very long periods of time, and engaging with humanity in a capacity that is simultaneously administrative and educational. The cuneiform tablets describing these beings are among the oldest written texts on Earth, and their content, whatever its ultimate origin, has been the subject of serious academic attention for over a century. The praying mantis itself holds a specific and significant place in the religious and mythological traditions of several of the world's indigenous cultures. In the traditions of the San people of southern Africa, one of the oldest continuous cultural traditions on Earth, with deep roots in a hunter-gatherer way of life that extends back perhaps 100,000 years. The praying mantis is the central divine figure. The San deity, known as Kagan, sometimes translated as Mantis, is a shape-shifting, often capricious, but ultimately cosmically significant being who played a role in the creation of the world and who continues to serve as a mediator between the human world and the spiritual realm. The San conception of Kagan is not a simple nature deity. It is a complex, paradoxical figure that seems to embody the difficulty of the relationship between human limited understanding and a cosmic intelligence that exceeds it. The fact that this oldest of living cultural traditions places an insect form being at the center of its cosmology is, in the context of the Mantis Being phenomenon, a datum that demands attention. Similar resonances appear in the cosmological traditions of certain Native American cultures, particularly in the southwestern United States, where the figure of the grandmother spider, a being of enormous wisdom and creative power who is associated with the organization of reality and the transmission of knowledge between cosmic levels, has characteristics that researchers have noted as structurally parallel to the Mantis Being template. The spider grandmother of Hopi tradition is not physically identical to the Mantis Being, but her role, as a cosmic-level intelligence that mediates between the human world and something vaster, that has participated in the organization of human civilization, and that continues to communicate with humans who have the sensitivity to receive her, parallels the Mantis Being's role in contact accounts with a specificity that goes beyond coincidental morphological comparison. The Chinese tradition, one of the oldest continuous cultural traditions in the Eastern world, contains within its complex mythological canon references to beings whose description and role have been compared by several researchers to the Mantis Being type. The concept of the Jade Emperor's celestial bureaucracy, an elaborate hierarchy of cosmic beings responsible for the administration of different aspects of natural and human reality, is less directly relevant than certain specific figures associated with wisdom, longevity, and the transmission of knowledge to humanity. More directly relevant is a subset of Chinese cosmological texts, some predating the Han Dynasty, that describe encounters with beings of unusual height and insect-like physical characteristics who arrived from the sky and who engaged with early human civilizations in ways that the texts characterize as both instructive and demanding. These texts are not part of the mainstream of Chinese classical literature, and they have received relatively little attention from either Western scholars or the UFO research community, partly because of the linguistic barriers and partly because of the inevitable difficulty of disentangling the cosmological symbolism from any potentially factual content. But they exist, and their existence adds another thread to a tapestry that is becoming increasingly dense. The Dogon people of Mali in West Africa provide what is perhaps the most famous and most debated case of ancient non-human knowledge transfer in the ethnographic literature. The Dogon possess detailed astronomical knowledge about the Sirius star system, specifically about Sirius B, the small, dense companion star to Sirius that was not confirmed by Western science until 1970, that appears, by any conventional account, impossible to have obtained through unaided human observation. The Dogon explanation for this knowledge is that it was transmitted to them by beings they call the Nomo, described as amphibious beings from the Sirius system who visited Earth in ancient times and who provided the ancestors of the Dogon with a cosmological education that included detailed information about the structure of their home stellar system. The Nomo are not described in terms that match the Mantis Being template precisely, but the structural similarity of their role as beings from a specific stellar location who transmit cosmological knowledge to humans and the cosmological precision of the knowledge apparently transmitted are exactly the kind of ancient contact narrative that Mantis Being communications consistently reference when they describe their own history with the human species. The worldwide distribution of cultural traditions involving insect-formed beings in positions of cosmic authority, wisdom, or creative power is not something that conventional anthropology has developed a satisfying account of. The conventional explanation that insects are ubiquitous in the human environment and that their unusual physical characteristics make them natural candidates for symbolic and divine roles in human cosmology is true as far as it goes, but does not adequately explain the specificity of the mantis form, as opposed to other insects, in traditions as geographically and culturally separated as the San of southern Africa and the indigenous Australians, or the specific and consistent association of mantis-like forms with wisdom, cosmic knowledge, and the transmission of intelligence from a higher to a lower realm. The conventional explanation explains the general presence of insect forms in mythology. It does not explain the specific, global, cross-cultural prominence of the mantis form as the embodiment of cosmic wisdom and the mediator between human and divine intelligence. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, the proposal that some elements of the world's mythological traditions preserve genuine memories of encounters with non-human intelligent visitors from beyond the Earth, has been treated by mainstream academia with a contempt that is, in some cases, justified by the quality of the arguments made in its favor, and in other cases is disproportionate to the actual evidence. The field has attracted its share of sensationalism and intellectual dishonesty, particularly in its popular media incarnations. But the underlying question, whether any element of the ancient mythological and religious record reflects genuine encounters with non-human intelligences, is a legitimate one that cannot be disposed of simply by associating it with its least rigorous advocates. The specific parallel between mantis being encounter accounts gathered by serious researchers in the second half of the 20th century and mythological traditions gathered by serious anthropologists and historians across multiple cultures and multiple centuries is not the invention of television documentary producers. It is a genuine convergence that demands a genuine intellectual response. Several of the researchers most deeply engaged with the mantis being phenomenon have proposed what might be called the long engagement model, the hypothesis that what the contact literature documents is not a new phenomenon but a very old one, and that the mythological and religious traditions of ancient human cultures preserve, in forms adapted to their particular symbolic and narrative vocabularies, genuine memories of the same kind of contact that is being reported in the modern era. In this model, the ancient Egyptians were not imagining Thoth. They were encoding, in the form of a divine narrative that their cultural context could accommodate, an encounter with a being that matched the mantis template, a being associated with wisdom, with the transmission of knowledge from a cosmic level to a human level, and with the mediation between a higher and a lower order of reality. The San were not inventing Kagan. They were encoding, in the form appropriate to their cultural and cosmological framework, a being whose role in their world matched the role that the Mantis Beings appear to play in the modern encounter accounts, a being that bridged the gap between human and cosmic intelligence, that was unpredictable and demanding, but ultimately oriented towards something important. The long engagement model, if accurate, has implications that are staggering in their scope. It would mean that the Mantis Beings have been present in human experience, not just as occasional visitors, but as a consistent presence, shaping human religious thought, influencing the development of human civilization, transmitting knowledge and perspective through whatever channels were available, for tens of thousands of years. It would mean that human history, properly understood, is not the story of an isolated species struggling alone on its small planet, but the story of a species in relationship with something vastly older and more capable, a relationship that has shaped us, that has been shaping us, and that is, in the current era, entering a new phase whose nature and implications are only beginning to become clear. The modern encounter accounts, in this light, are not the beginning of a story. They are the current chapter of a very old one. The Mantis Beings are not visitors from somewhere else. They are, in a sense, a permanent feature of the human situation, not of our physical environment perhaps, but of the broader context of intelligence and consciousness within which human life takes place. They have been here, in whatever sense they are here, for as long as we have, and what they want from us, or what they are doing with us, or for us, is a question whose answer may be encoded not just in the encounter accounts of the past century, but in the full scope of the human religious, mythological, and philosophical tradition. The story of humanity's relationship with a cosmic intelligence is the oldest story we tell. The Mantis Beings may be the reason we have always needed to tell it. The specific stellar associations that appear in Mantis being communications deserve attention in this context. A number of witnesses report that during their encounters, the Mantis beings transmitted information about their place of origin or primary activity that was specifically astronomical, that connected them to particular regions of the sky or particular stellar systems. The most frequently cited stellar associations in the Mantis being literature are the Orion constellation, the Pleiades star cluster, and the Zeta Reticuli star system, the same associations that appear prominently in the gray entity literature and that have been the subject of significant independent inquiry. The fact that these associations appear in Mantis being accounts as well as gray entity accounts is consistent with the hierarchical model. If the grays and the Mantis beings share an organizational structure, they may also share an astronomical origin or operating base, with the Mantis beings representing the oldest or most senior element of a community that has its roots in one of these stellar neighborhoods. The Orion association is particularly interesting in the context of ancient mythological parallels because Orion is one of the most consistent and most widely recognized stellar associations in the world's ancient astronomical and mythological traditions. From the ancient Egyptians, whose Great Pyramid complex at Giza appears to be aligned with the stars of Orion's belt, to the indigenous peoples of North America, Australia, and Polynesia, the stars of Orion have carried a consistent significance, typically associated with beings of power and authority, with the realm of the dead or the divine, and with the cycles of cosmic time. The Orion association in both ancient mythology and modern contact accounts is not proof of anything in isolation, but it is another thread in a tapestry of convergence that becomes more compelling the more threads you identify. The encounter between human civilization and the beings that the modern literature calls the Mantis beings is, in the long engagement model, a relationship that has produced some of the defining features of human culture: the drive toward knowledge, the search for cosmic meaning, the intuition of an intelligence greater than the human, the sense that the universe is not indifferent but organized. These may not be the purely endogenous products of biological evolution and cultural development that the conventional account assumes. They may be, at least in part, the fruits of a very long education, an education conducted by beings for whom the development of human consciousness is not a side interest but a primary concern. And if that is true, if the Mantis beings are, in the deepest sense, the teachers behind the entire project of human civilization's engagement with wisdom and meaning, then encountering them is not just a strange and frightening experience that happens to certain individuals in the middle of the night. It is an encounter with something that is woven into the fabric of what human beings are, with something that has been part of our story from the very beginning. The transformation effect: how encounters change human beings. There is a pattern in the aftermath of Mantis being encounters that is so consistent, so specific, and so distinct from the aftermath of most other categories of traumatic or extraordinary experience that it constitutes, in the judgment of several researchers, one of the most important datasets in the entire field. The pattern is transformation, not recovery from trauma, though trauma is frequently part of the picture, not simply the psychological adjustment that any person makes after a disturbing experience. Something more profound and more specific than either of those. The witnesses who have experienced Mantis being encounters are changed in ways that they themselves characterize as ontological, as affecting not just their beliefs or their emotional state, but the very structure of their consciousness and their relationship with reality. The documentation of this transformation effect begins with the clinical observations of researchers who worked directly with experiencers over extended periods of time. John Mack, operating from his clinical training as a psychiatrist and his commitment to taking the phenomenon seriously on its own terms, was one of the first to systematically describe what he called the transformative aspect of the abduction experience. Mack noted that his subjects, including, prominently, those whose encounters had featured Mantis-type entities, showed a specific constellation of changes in the aftermath of their experiences that did not fit any existing clinical model. They did not show the pattern of recovery and stabilization that characterizes the aftermath of traumatic events. They showed instead a pattern of ongoing development, of deepening rather than resolution, of expanding rather than settling. Their encounters had not happened to them and then stopped. The encounters had started something that continued to unfold, sometimes for years or decades, in ways that consistently moved toward greater complexity, greater awareness, and greater engagement with questions that most people spend their lives not asking. The cognitive changes documented in Mantis encounter aftermath are among the most consistently reported and the most objectively observable. A substantial number of witnesses report what they describe as a sudden or gradual emergence of capabilities or interests that had no prior basis in their experience or inclination. Scientists who suddenly find themselves grasping concepts in fields they had no previous training in. Artists who find that their creative work has shifted in both quality and content towards something they did not choose and cannot fully explain. Writers, composers, mathematicians, healers, people across the full range of human creative and intellectual endeavor who describe their post-encounter development as shaped by something they received in the encounter but can access more fully only over time. The transfer of capability through Mantis contact, the seeding of a potential that the witness then grows into, is one of the phenomenon's most remarkable features and one of the most difficult to account for through any conventional psychological model. The perceptual changes are equally well documented and equally striking. Many witnesses report that after a Mantis encounter, their sensory and perceptual experience of the world is qualitatively different. Colors appear more vivid or more complex, as though the visual system has been calibrated to a different, more sensitive mode. Sounds carry more information, or are experienced as having a musicality that they did not previously seem to possess. The natural world, the behavior of animals, the growth of plants, the movement of weather, becomes readable in a way that it was not before, as though the witness has been given access to a language of natural patterns that was always there, but that they previously had no faculty for perceiving. Some witnesses describe what can only be called an enhanced empathy, a direct physical experience of the emotional states of other people, not as inference from behavior, but as something more immediate, something felt. This empathic enhancement is consistently described as both a gift and a burden, profound in its richness and exhausting in its demands. The spiritual dimension of the transformation effect is the most difficult to discuss in the context of a documentary whose primary register is analytical and empirical, but it cannot be omitted without fundamentally misrepresenting what witnesses report. The most common single statement made by Mantis encounter witnesses about the effect of their experience on their spiritual or philosophical understanding of reality is this: "I know now that consciousness continues after death, not as a belief, not as a comfort, as something they experienced directly in the encounter, and that left them with a certainty that they find both liberating and, in a sense, additional to the ordinary burdens of human life. The certainty that consciousness is not ended by the death of the physical body is transmitted in Mantis encounters, not as a theological proposition, but as a direct experiential fact, as something the being shows the witness by briefly expanding their awareness to a register where this fact is simply visible. Whether this transmission reflects genuine knowledge about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical death, or whether it represents a sophisticated and intentional construction designed to produce a specific effect in the witness, is not something that can be determined from the witness accounts alone. But the consistency with which this transmission is reported, across independent accounts, across cultures, across decades, is one of the most striking facts in the entire literature. The behavioral changes that follow Mantis encounters are as significant as the cognitive and perceptual changes, because they translate what is an internal transformation into observable impact on the witness's life and relationships. The most consistent behavioral shift is what researchers have described as a reorientation of values, a fundamental change in what the witness finds important, what they find worth spending their energy on, what they find tolerable and intolerable in the structure of their social and institutional life. Witnesses describe losing interest in the acquisition of material wealth and social status. They describe finding the conventional motivating structures of contemporary life, career advancement, consumer consumption, social competition, suddenly empty in a way that they find difficult to communicate to people who have not had a similar experience. And they describe a corresponding intensification of interest in things that, before the encounter, would not have held their attention. The health of ecosystems, the welfare of children, the nature of consciousness, the relationship between individual human life and the larger context of biological and cosmic time. This reorientation of values has practical consequences that are not always comfortable. Marriages end because one partner has been fundamentally changed and the relationship cannot accommodate the change. Careers are abandoned because the work that was formerly meaningful has lost its meaning, and a different kind of work, less socially or financially rewarded, but more aligned with the post-encounter sense of purpose, calls with an urgency that cannot be ignored. Social networks dissolve because the witness has been changed in ways that make ordinary social interaction feel shallow and unsatisfying, and has not yet found a community that can receive them as they now are. The transformation effect is real, and it has real costs. The witness does not emerge from the Mantis encounter the same person, and the world they return to is not equipped to accommodate the person they have become. The community of contact experiencers, the informal but real network of individuals who have had encounters of various types and who have found each other, particularly in the internet era, provides some of the most valuable testimony about the long-term trajectory of the transformation effect. Within this community, the Mantis encounter experiencers form a distinct and recognizable subgroup, identified not by the physical characteristics of their encounters, but by the quality and direction of their subsequent transformation. They tend, as a group, to be the most engaged with questions of consciousness and its relationship to matter. They tend to be the most actively involved in environmental and ecological issues, consistent with the urgency of the ecological message that Mantis beings consistently transmit. They tend to be the most comfortable with uncertainty, not the paralyzed uncertainty of someone who cannot function without clear answers, but the active, curious uncertainty of someone who has had direct experience of a reality vastly more complex than any simple answer could accommodate. And they tend, in the accounts they give of their ongoing development, to describe themselves as still engaged in a process that the original encounter initiated, still receiving, still growing, still moving toward an understanding that feels tantalizingly close, but not yet fully arrived. The therapeutic dimension of the transformation effect is important and has been addressed by the relatively small number of clinicians who work seriously with contact experiencers. The challenge that a Mantis encounter poses to conventional psychotherapy is not primarily about the strangeness of the reported experience. It is about the inadequacy of the therapeutic models available. Standard trauma therapy is designed to help clients restore their pre-trauma level of functioning, to help them return to the baseline state that existed before the disturbing event. But the Mantis encounter experiencer does not want to return to their pre-encounter baseline. In the majority of cases, they regard the encounter as having expanded their awareness and their capacity for life in ways that they value, however difficult the adjustment has been. What they need from a therapeutic relationship is not help returning to where they were. It is help integrating what they have become, help making sense of changes that are real and significant, and that the conventional conceptual frameworks available in any therapeutic context are typically not equipped to address. A small number of clinicians, including, notably, Dr. Mack and the therapists associated with his research program, and more recently, researchers and practitioners working through organizations like the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, have developed therapeutic approaches that are designed to meet contact experiencers where they actually are, rather than where conventional psychology assumes they should be. These approaches take the reported experience seriously in the sense of not presuming to know its ultimate ontological status, while helping the experiencer to understand, contextualize, and integrate what has happened to them in terms that honor its full complexity. The results of these approaches, documented across multiple practitioners and multiple client populations, suggest that the transformation effect can be supported and developed rather than suppressed and normalized. and that when it is, the outcome for the individual is generally positive, even given the genuine difficulties of the adjustment process. The sociological implications of the transformation effect are as significant as its individual psychological implications. If a meaningful fraction of the population, and the numbers, when you aggregate the contact experience literature from multiple countries, are not trivially small, has been through an experience that has fundamentally reoriented their values toward ecological sustainability, consciousness exploration, and what might be called cosmic citizenship, then the aggregate effect of these individual transformations is a non-trivial cultural force, not a revolutionary force, at least not yet. The stigma attached to disclosure of contact experience suppresses the social impact of the transformation in ways that are difficult to fully quantify, but a real force present in communities and families and professional networks, shaping the behavior of people who have not disclosed their encounters and who are, therefore, not identifiable as contact experiencers by those around them. The Mantis Beings, if the transformation effect is intentional, if the reorientation of witnesses' values and priorities is a designed feature of the encounter rather than an inadvertent side effect, are performing, through the contact process, a kind of cultural seeding. They are introducing into the human population individuals who have been fundamentally reoriented toward the values and concerns that their communications consistently identify as critical: ecological consciousness, awareness of the nature of consciousness itself, and a sense of responsibility that extends beyond the individual and the national to the planetary and the cosmic. Whether this seeding is proceeding at the scale and pace necessary to produce the cultural change that would address the concerns the beings communicate is another question, one that the beings themselves, in the urgency of the ecological message, appear to regard as not yet settled. But the fact of the seeding, the deliberate, systematic, decades-long process of transforming specific individuals and, through them, influencing the human cultural conversation, is, in the judgment of the researchers who have looked most carefully at the full scope of the phenomenon, one of the most important things that is actually happening. The transformation effect is, in the end, what distinguishes the Mantis Being phenomenon most fundamentally from a conventional extraterrestrial contact scenario. If the Mantis Beings were simply collecting biological specimens and returning them, the encounter would be disturbing, but its implications would be primarily scientific, about the biology of the beings and the technical capability of their enterprise. The transformation effect makes the implications personal, cultural, and civilizational. Something is being done to the people who encounter these beings that changes them, that changes their relationship with reality, and that changes, however subtly, however indirectly, the world they live in and the conversations they participate in. Whatever the Mantis Beings are, they are not passive collectors of data. They are active agents of transformation, and the world they are transforming is this one, with all its weight and beauty and urgent fragility. The skeptics, the science, and the problem of proof. No honest treatment of the Mantis Being phenomenon can avoid the substantial body of skeptical argument that surrounds it, and no treatment that wishes to be taken seriously should try to. The skeptical critique of the contact experience literature is not monolithic. It ranges from the measured, intellectually engaged skepticism of scientists who take the witness accounts seriously as data while questioning their interpretation, to the reflexive, politically motivated dismissiveness of institutional critics who regard the entire field as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a question to be answered. The distinction between these two kinds of skepticism matters enormously, and conflating them, treating the serious intellectual critique and the institutional contempt as though they are the same thing, serves nobody's understanding of the phenomenon or its implications. The most compelling skeptical arguments against the literal interpretation of Mantis Being encounters fall into several categories, each of which deserves careful treatment. The first and most fundamental is the absence of physical evidence. There is no Mantis Being tissue sample in any laboratory. There is no technological artifact whose provenance can be unambiguously traced to a non-human intelligence. There is no recording, no photograph, no video, no instrument-captured datum that constitutes direct physical evidence of the being's existence in the conventional material sense. This absence is real, and it is significant. It does not constitute proof of absence. The logical fallacy of treating the non-discovery of something as proof that it does not exist is basic and well understood. But it means that the entire evidentiary case for the Mantis phenomenon rests on witness testimony, and witness testimony alone is, by any standard of empirical scientific inquiry, insufficient to establish the existence of a genuinely novel physical entity. The witness testimony problem is compounded by the specific conditions under which most Mantis encounters are reported to occur. The majority of encounters happen at night, when the witness is either asleep or in a hypnagogic or hypnopompic state, the transitional states between sleep and waking that are well documented in the sleep science literature as producing vivid, sometimes very complex hallucinations that the experiencer may find difficult to distinguish from real events. The phenomenon of sleep paralysis, the temporary inability to move that sometimes accompanies these transitional states, combined with hallucinatory experiences of a threatening presence or figure in the room, has been proposed as the explanation for a large fraction of the contact experience literature. The sleep paralysis explanation is taken seriously by a significant community of sleep researchers and neuroscientists, and it cannot be dismissed without engaging with its specific claims. What the serious engagement reveals, however, is that sleep paralysis, while it can produce some of the elements of a contact experience account, cannot account for the full spectrum of what witnesses report. Sleep paralysis hallucinations are typically brief, fragmentary, and idiosyncratic. They do not produce the multi-hour, internally consistent, narratively structured experiences that characterize complex Mantis encounter accounts. They do not produce the specific, cross-culturally consistent physical descriptions that appear in the independent witness literature. They do not produce the lasting physiological changes, the unusual skin marks, the documented implants, the physiological anomalies that medical examination has noted in a subset of cases. And they do not produce the cognitive and behavioral transformation effect that is the most consistent and most significant feature of the Mantis encounter aftermath. Sleep paralysis is a real and important phenomenon. It is not an adequate explanation of the Mantis being encounter literature. The hypothesis of false memory, the idea that the experiences reported by witnesses are confabulations produced by hypnotic suggestion or by the suggestive power of the cultural climate around alien contact experiences, or by the witness's own psychological processing of ordinary disturbing events into an extraordinary framework, is more sophisticated than the sleep paralysis explanation and deserves more careful treatment. The false memory literature in psychology is extensive, rigorous, and well supported. Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues have demonstrated conclusively that human memory is not a recording device, but a reconstructive process that is vulnerable to contamination, suggestion, and confabulation in ways that feel, to the person experiencing them, indistinguishable from genuine memory. Hypnotic regression, in particular, has been shown to enhance the production of false memories rather than simply to recover genuine ones in ways that have serious implications for the use of hypnosis in recovering contact experience accounts. The false memory critique has to be taken seriously, and the researchers who have been most intellectually honest about the Mantis phenomenon, including Mack, and more recently researchers like Ray Hernandez and the team behind the free study, Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences, have taken it seriously. They have responded to it in ways that are worth examining. First, they have noted that the false memory critique, while applicable to a subset of the encounter literature, particularly accounts recovered exclusively under hypnotic regression with researchers who had preformed beliefs about the nature of contact experiences, does not apply to the substantial fraction of the literature that comes from conscious, waking recollection, never touched by hypnosis. Second, they have noted that false memory research has demonstrated that memory is contaminated by what the person already knows or believes, but the cross-cultural, cross-demographic consistency of the Mantis being description makes it extremely difficult to identify a shared cultural source that could contaminate independent witnesses' memories in the specific ways required to produce the consistent description. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they have noted that the false memory critique addresses the process of memory retrieval, but cannot account for the physical evidence that exists in a subset of cases: the skin marks, the implants, the physiological changes, which require a physical encounter of some kind to explain, regardless of what the witness consciously remembers about it. The psychological interpretation, the hypothesis that contact experiences, including mantis encounters, are products of the witness's own psychology, perhaps drawing on archetypal or universal material in the collective unconscious rather than on external physical events, is the most intellectually sophisticated of the skeptical frameworks and the one that is most difficult to definitively refute. Carl Jung developed this framework in his late essay, Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies, in which he proposed that UFO phenomena, including the beings associated with them, might be manifestations of the collective unconscious, products of the psyche rather than intrusions from external physical reality. The Jungian interpretation has been developed and extended by subsequent thinkers, and in its most sophisticated form, it proposes that the specific forms taken by contact experiences, including the Mantis Beings' physical characteristics and behavioral patterns, reflect the structure of the deep unconscious rather than the characteristics of literal extraterrestrial beings. The problem with the Jungian interpretation is not that it is wrong about the psychological depth of the contact experience. It is probably right that the experience engages deep layers of the psyche in ways that purely physical encounters do not. The problem is that it presupposes that the psychological and the physical are cleanly separable, that an experience is either a product of the psyche or a product of external physical reality and cannot be both simultaneously. But the phenomenon of consciousness itself suggests that this clean separation may be false. If consciousness and matter are not as clearly distinguishable as the conventional materialist model assumes, if consciousness, at some level, shapes the physical reality it appears to merely observe, then the distinction between a psychologically produced and a physically real experience may be less clear than either the believer or the skeptic assumes. The mantis being may be both a manifestation of something deep in the human psyche and an entity with an independent existence beyond the psyche. These two possibilities are not mutually exclusive if the relationship between consciousness and reality is more complex than the conventional model allows. The sociological critique of the contact experience literature focuses on the cultural and social factors that shape the reporting and interpretation of anomalous experiences. It notes that the content of reported contact experiences has changed over time in ways that track cultural trends, that the beings reported in the 1950s looked like idealized Nordics, consistent with Cold War racial anxieties, that the grays of the 1970s and 1980s reflected science fiction imagery that was becoming widely distributed in that period, and that the content of contact accounts in general tends to reflect the cultural and technological preoccupations of the period in which they occur. This is a real observation and a genuine challenge to any interpretation that takes the literal content of contact accounts at face value. But it proves too much if it is taken to its logical conclusion. If the entire contact experience literature is merely a cultural mirror, then the cross-cultural, cross-temporal consistency of the mantis being description, which does not track any obvious cultural trend and which appears in accounts from cultures with no shared media environment, becomes inexplicable. The neuroscience of anomalous experience has advanced considerably in recent decades, and it has produced genuinely relevant insights into the mantis encounter phenomenon. Research on the brain states associated with near-death experiences, meditation states, psychedelic states, and related categories of profound unusual experience has identified specific neurological signatures that are associated with the reports of expanded consciousness, direct knowing, and contact with apparently external intelligent presences that characterize these experiences. The neurological research does not settle the question of whether these states involve genuine contact with an external reality. The question of what the brain is doing is not the same as the question of what the brain is perceiving, but it does illuminate the mechanisms through which extraordinary experiences become possible, and it provides a framework within which the specific character of the mantis encounter, the mode of communication, the quality of presence, the perceptual expansion, can be understood at a mechanistic level without necessarily reducing it to a purely internal event. The contributions of scientists of the stature of Dr. Gary Nolan, the Stanford immunologist and geneticist who has applied cutting-edge biological analysis to anomalous materials and to the physical examination of contact experiencers, represent a new and important development in the scientific engagement with these questions. Nolan's work, which includes analysis of the neurological profiles of contact experiencers using advanced brain imaging techniques, has produced findings that are not easily accommodated within the conventional frameworks. Certain contact experiencers, including some who report mantis encounters, show a specific pattern of neurological organization, a higher density of neural connections in regions associated with pattern recognition and the integration of complex information. That is not typical of the general population, and that does not fit the profile expected of individuals who are either psychologically disordered or simply fabricating experiences. Nolan's interpretation of these findings is careful and scientifically conservative. He argues that they indicate that certain individuals have neurological profiles that make them more likely to perceive or interact with whatever phenomenon is generating these experiences. This interpretation is consistent with both the literal extraterrestrial contact hypothesis and with the psychological hypothesis, and Nolan has been appropriately explicit about not being able to adjudicate between them on the basis of neurological data alone. The most important recent development in the scientific and governmental engagement with the broader anomalous aerial phenomena context, the 2017 New York Times revelation that the Pentagon had been running a secret program studying UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, followed by the subsequent congressional hearings and official government acknowledgement of the reality of unidentified objects in restricted airspace, changes the context of the entire conversation about the mantis phenomenon in ways that are still being absorbed. If the government of the world's most technologically advanced military power has been secretly studying aerial phenomena for decades, and if individuals within that program, including decorated military officers whose credibility is difficult to dismiss on any simple psychological or sociological grounds, have made statements about the reality of non-human intelligences associated with those phenomena, then the cultural and institutional context within which the mantis being witness literature exists is fundamentally different from what it was 20 years ago. The stigma has not disappeared, but its intellectual foundation has been substantially undermined. The default of dismissal can no longer be maintained with intellectual honesty. The serious scientific engagement that the phenomenon now demands and is beginning to receive is not going to produce simple, quick answers. The phenomenon is too complex, too poorly documented by the standards that science requires, and too deeply embedded in the intersection of the physical, the psychological, and the social to yield easily to investigation. But the investigation is underway, and it is being conducted increasingly by people with the training, the resources, and the institutional support to do it rigorously. The mantis being, as one of the most consistent and most consequential elements of the contact phenomenon, will inevitably be a focus of that investigation. What it will reveal is something that no honest analyst can currently predict. But the trajectory of investigation, from government acknowledgement to serious scientific inquiry to public discourse that no longer requires the speaker to risk professional destruction, is moving in a direction that promises, eventually, more light than the darkness that has characterized the subject for most of the past century. The critics are right that the current evidence is insufficient for definitive scientific conclusions about the literal existence of beings called the mantis. They are right to insist on rigor, on the consideration of alternative explanations, on the importance of physical evidence that has so far not materialized at the scale the phenomenon would seem to demand. But the critics are not right. The serious ones would not claim to be right, that the absence of current certainty is a license for dismissal. The witness testimony, gathered over decades by independent researchers from demographically diverse individuals in multiple countries with no shared cultural framework for the specific content they describe, is an enormous body of evidence that demands a response proportionate to its weight. That response is not to say, "It happened as described." It is to say, something significant is happening, it is consistent, it is cross-cultural, it is producing real effects in real people, and we do not understand it. That is the honest position. And from that honest position, the Mantis being demands to be taken seriously. Voices of the encountered, experiencer, testimony, and its weight. The most important thing that can be said about the witness testimony in the Mantis being literature is something very simple, and it is something that the field has sometimes lost sight of in its understandable urgency to theorize and interpret. These are human beings describing the most extraordinary experiences of their lives, experiences that have cost them something to disclose and that they bring forward, in the majority of cases, not because they seek attention or profit, but because they cannot, in good conscience, keep silent about what they have been through. The testimony is the center of the entire inquiry. Everything else, the theory, the analysis, the cultural comparison, the scientific speculation, orbits around it. And the testimony, when you encounter it directly, has a quality that no amount of theoretical scaffolding can either create or fully convey. Consider the account of a woman we will call Carol, who came forward through Barbara Lamb's research program in the late 1990s. Carol was a nurse in her late 40s, with no prior interest in UFO phenomena and no knowledge of the abduction literature when she first sought Lamb's help. She came initially because she was troubled by a pattern of experiences that she had been having since childhood. Experiences that woke her in the night, that left her physically affected, and that she had never been able to explain. Under regression, and later in conscious recollection, Carol described a being that she had encountered many times since the age of approximately 5. Very tall, triangular head, enormous dark eyes, long arms that she described as folding forward in a way that she could not fully explain and that she demonstrated, unsuccessfully, with her own arms. The being communicated with her, she said, in a way that was like receiving a weather system. Not a message exactly, but a state of understanding that arrived complete, that she then had to spend time and effort unpacking into something approaching sequential thought. The being told her, or transmitted to her, that she had a purpose that was connected to healing, that the encounters were part of a preparation for that purpose, and that she would understand more as she developed. Carol became, after her regression work with Lamb, one of the most gifted and sought-after nurses in her hospital's oncology unit. Her colleagues noted a quality in her patient interactions that they found impossible to define clinically, but that they recognized as exceptional, a capacity for presence with dying patients that went beyond professional competence into something else. Carol did not discuss her contact experiences with her colleagues, but she attributed her capacity for presence directly and explicitly to what she had received in those encounters. The account of a child, documented by Mary Rodwell in Australia through the child's mother who sought help understanding her daughter's experiences, provides a dimension of the witness testimony that is particularly resistant to the various dismissive explanations because children have neither the cultural knowledge nor the psychological complexity required to fabricate accounts of the specific kind that this child produced. The child, who was 7 years old at the time of her initial disclosure, and whose accounts Rodwell documented over a period of 2 years, described encounters with the tall ones that had been occurring, as far as she could express it, for her entire life. Her descriptions of the physical characteristics of the beings, the head shape, the eyes, the arms, the quality of presence, were produced spontaneously, without leading questions, and with a specificity and a consistency that Rodwell, working with children's contact accounts for over 2 decades, found immediately recognizable and immediately significant. The child described the communication of the beings as like thinking together, a phrase that she chose independently and that closely mirrors the language used by adult witnesses with no connection to her or her family. She described the beings as teaching me things I don't know yet. an account of the layered transmission quality that appears so consistently in adult mantis encounter descriptions, and she described a sense of relationship with the beings that was, in her 7-year-old's vocabulary, more complex and more ambivalent than either simple fear or simple affection, something between a grandmother who is strict and a teacher who knows things you don't, something that she trusted without entirely understanding. The diversity of the witness population is itself a testimony to the phenomenon's reality and to its refusal to conform to the cultural templates that critics would prefer to apply to it. If contact experiences were a function of psychological vulnerability, you would expect the witness population to skew toward the psychologically vulnerable. It does not. The contact experience literature, and the mantis encounter literature in particular, includes a higher than average representation of individuals with high levels of education, professional achievement, and psychological resilience. Exactly the opposite of what a contamination by vulnerability model would predict. If contact experiences were a function of exposure to science fiction media, you would expect the witness population to skew toward science fiction consumers. It does not, or rather, it skews no more in that direction than the general population, and many of the most detailed and most compelling accounts come from individuals who actively disliked science fiction and had minimal exposure to it. If contact experiences were a function of cultural suggestion, you would expect the content of accounts to vary systematically with cultural context. In the specifics that matter most, the physical description of the mantis being, the mode of communication, the quality of presence, the aftermath of transformation, it does not. The toll of disclosure is something that the witness testimony literature documents extensively and that receives insufficient attention in popular treatments of the subject. Coming forward with a mantis encounter account is not a consequence-free act. It exposes the witness to professional consequences, the loss of jobs, the questioning of competence, the informal social penalties that still attach to claims of this kind in most professional contexts. It exposes them to personal consequences, the questioning of relationships, the isolation that comes from having experiences that cannot be shared with most of the people one is closest to. It exposes them to psychological consequences, the reliving of experiences that are, in their initial character, deeply disturbing, and the management of a set of changes and uncertainties that have no established framework of support in the broader culture. People who come forward with these accounts, in full knowledge of these costs, are not doing so for simple reasons of attention-seeking or social reward. They are doing so because the experience was real to them, and because the reality of it demands acknowledgement, at least from those with the courage to receive it. The international dimension of the witness testimony, the fact that the accounts come from every inhabited region of the globe, described in dozens of different languages by people embedded in dozens of different cultural frameworks, is something that the full scope of the research literature makes abundantly clear, but that is difficult to convey in the compressed format of any single treatment. Researchers who have had the opportunity to review contact experience testimony from non-Western cultures in the original languages, Japanese, Brazilian Portuguese, various African languages, Arabic, consistently report the same experience, that the core description, the essential phenomenology, the quality of the encounter and its aftermath, translates across every cultural boundary they encounter. The mantis being, as encountered in rural Japan in the 1980s, is the same mantis being encountered in suburban Ohio in the 1990s, which is the same mantis being encountered in the Australian outback in the 2000s. The details differ in their cultural coloring. The thing being described does not differ in its fundamental character. The longitudinal testimony, the accounts of witnesses who have maintained contact over periods of decades and who can describe the evolution of the relationship between themselves and the beings, is perhaps the most structurally significant category of witness evidence, because it reveals that what is happening is not a series of isolated random events, but a relationship. Relationships have structure, they have direction, they move somewhere over time. And the direction in which the longitudinal mantis encounter relationships move across the independent accounts of witnesses who have no knowledge of each other is strikingly consistent. They move from terror to understanding, from violation to something more like collaboration. from the helpless passivity of a subject to the uncertain but real agency of a participant. The beings in these longitudinal accounts do not stay the same in their relationship with the witness. They seem to respond to the witness's development, to become more communicative, more explicit, more willing to engage at the level the witness has grown into as the witness develops. This responsiveness is itself extraordinary. It implies that the beings are not running a fixed program, but are engaged in a genuine relationship, one in which the witness's growth is tracked, valued, and responded to, one in which the witness is not merely a subject, but, however imperfectly and asymmetrically, a partner. What the witness testimony, in all its diversity and its weight, ultimately communicates is something very simple and very extraordinary. Something is meeting us. Something has been meeting us for a long time. It meets us in our most vulnerable moments, in the space between sleep and waking, in the quiet of the night when the ordinary social world has dropped its guard. It meets us with a presence that our bodies recognize before our minds do. It changes us, without our full consent, but also, in many cases, without our total resistance. It is trying to tell us something. It has been trying to tell us something for generations. And what it is trying to tell us, whatever the precise content of any individual encounter across all the cultural variations and all the individual differences, seems, when you look at the full body of testimony, to converge on a set of truths that the human species, in its current configuration, is having enormous difficulty hearing. About the state of the living world we inhabit, about the nature of our own consciousness, about our place in a cosmos that is far more alive, far more organized, and far more interested in us than our current model of reality allows. The agenda and the future, purpose, intention, and what comes next. Every phenomenon that is organized and intentional has an agenda, not in the pejorative sense of hidden manipulation, but in the straightforward sense of a purpose being pursued through a coherent set of activities over time. The Mantis Beings, as the accumulated evidence of their encounters presents them, are organized and intentional. They therefore have an agenda, and while the full scope of that agenda is not available from the witness testimony alone, while the beings are not, apparently, in the business of full disclosure to any individual witness, the contours of it can be discerned, with some confidence, from the aggregate of what they communicate and what they do. The ecological agenda is the most urgent and the most consistently transmitted component of the Mantis communication. Across decades of independent encounter accounts from witnesses in every part of the world, the beings communicate the same essential message about the Earth's biosphere. It is in serious distress. The rate at which complex biological life is being lost, the extinction acceleration that conservative scientific estimates now suggest is proceeding at 100 to 1,000 times the background rate, represents, in the Mantis Beings' apparent assessment, a threat to something that they regard as of fundamental importance, not merely to human life, though the consequences for human life are clearly part of the message, to something larger than human life, to the complex web of conscious and semi-conscious experience that constitutes the living biosphere as a whole. The Mantis Beings communicate about the biosphere in terms that suggest they regard it as having a value that goes beyond its utility to any particular species, a value that is intrinsic, cosmic, and irreplaceable. The language witnesses use to translate this communication is frequently religious, sacred, miraculous, once in a universe precious, and the being's apparent reaction to its ongoing destruction is communicated with an emotional intensity that witnesses find more overwhelming, more disturbing than anything else in the encounter. What specifically the beings are communicating, and through the transformation of their witnesses, attempting to catalyze in response to the ecological situation, is not entirely clear from the accounts. They are not, apparently, delivering a simple action plan. They are not telling witnesses to recycle, or to vote for particular policies, or to join particular organizations. The intervention they appear to be making is at a deeper level, a recalibration of value, a restructuring of the witness's fundamental sense of what matters, that is intended to produce behaviors and choices and influences that cannot be specified in advance because they depend on the unique circumstances of each witness's life. The seeding is of a quality of consciousness, an ecological consciousness in the deepest sense, rather than of a set of specific behaviors. The bet, apparently, is that if enough human beings are genuinely, fundamentally reoriented toward the value of the living world, the behaviors that are needed will follow. The question is whether the number and the influence of the witnesses who have been through this reorientation process is sufficient at this stage to produce the cultural inflection that the being's communications suggest is urgently needed. The consciousness agenda, the being's apparent interest in the development of human conscious awareness, is the most philosophically complex component of the Mantis program and the one most directly connected to the transformation effect described in the previous section. The Mantis beings communicate, across the full breadth of their encounter transmissions, a specific concern with the gap between what human consciousness currently is and what it is capable of becoming. They communicate this not as criticism or condescension. Witnesses rarely describe the communication as having a quality of judgment, but with something more like the patient urgency of a teacher who knows that the student has the capacity for understanding but has not yet found their way to it. The development of expanded consciousness in human beings, consciousness that can perceive its own cosmic context, that can operate from an awareness of its fundamental interconnection with other consciousness, that can access the direct knowing mode that the Mantis beings themselves appear to employ, is, in this reading of the contact literature, the deepest of the being's concerns and the ultimate goal of the transformation process. Why the Mantis beings care about the development of human consciousness, what they stand to gain from it, or what the broader system of which they are a part stands to gain, is a question that the witness testimony addresses only obliquely and incompletely. Some witnesses describe transmissions suggesting that the development of conscious species is itself a cosmic purpose, that the universe is engaged in a process of self-awareness through the development of conscious beings within it, and that the Mantis beings are among the agents of this process. Others describe transmissions suggesting that the Mantis beings have a specific stake in human development, that the trajectory of human consciousness has implications for a much larger web of intelligent life, and that the cultivation of human potential is connected to a cosmic balance or harmony that affects entities far beyond the human. Still others describe transmissions that are less philosophical and more operational. Humans have specific capacities, in our particular combination of emotional depth, creative power, and developmental flexibility, that are rare in the cosmos, and the Mantis beings are cultivating these capacities for reasons that remain unclear but that appear to be connected to something that requires them. The hybridization agenda, the question of whether the Mantis beings, or the program they oversee, is engaged in a process of genetic or biological integration between non-human and human biological material, is one of the most controversial aspects of the entire contact research literature. David Jacobs, based on his extensive case research, has argued that hybridization is the primary purpose of the contact program, that the beings are creating hybrid entities who can exist in human society while carrying a non-human genetic or consciousness component, and that this hybridization program is proceeding at a scale and a pace that has serious implications for the future of the human species. Jacobs' hybridization hypothesis has been contested by other researchers, including some who share his commitment to taking the contact phenomenon seriously on both evidentiary and ethical grounds. The evidentiary challenge is that the physical evidence for hybridization, whatever it would look like and however it could be obtained and evaluated, is even more elusive than the physical evidence for the encounters themselves. The ethical challenge is that a program that involves the unconsented genetic modification of human beings, at whatever scale, would represent an intervention in human affairs of extraordinary consequence. The Mantis beings' role in the hybridization question, as it appears in the case literature, is characteristically supervisory. Witnesses who describe encounters with apparent hybrid entities, beings who have both human and non-human characteristics, who sometimes appear to be integrated into human social settings, and who are described as having a relationship with the Mantis beings that is different from and more personal than the relationship between the Mantis beings and ordinary human witnesses, position the Mantis beings as overseers of a very long-term biological project. The project is described, in the transmissions that witnesses receive, as having a purpose connected to the survival and development of life in the face of the very threats that the ecological message identifies. If the biosphere is under threat, and if human activity is the primary driver of that threat, then the insurance of biological and consciousness continuity in forms that can persist through or beyond the crisis, through forms that are more adaptable, more conscious, more connected to the larger web of life than current human beings typically are, may be what the hybridization project is actually about. This interpretation does not make the ethical questions easier, but it does place them in a context that is considerably less straightforwardly sinister than some accounts suggest. The disclosure agenda, the question of whether the Mantis beings are moving toward or away from open acknowledgement of their presence and their program, is one that the current moment in official and public discourse makes newly relevant. The pattern of increasing official government acknowledgement of the UAP phenomenon, the increasing willingness of credible public figures to speak seriously about non-human intelligence, and the documented existence of programs within the United States and other governments aimed at studying and, in some cases, recovering materials associated with non-human craft. All of this creates a context for asking whether the trajectory toward greater disclosure is externally driven, internally driven, or some combination of both. The witness testimony on this point is ambiguous. Some witnesses describe transmissions that suggest the Mantis beings regard the current period as a critical juncture, a phase in the evolution of human awareness at which a more explicit acknowledgement of the contact phenomenon becomes both possible and necessary. Others describe transmissions that suggest the beings are patient in a way that implies no particular urgency about disclosure in any conventional sense, that their timeline is different enough from the human one, that the difference between disclosure now and disclosure in another generation is not, from their perspective, particularly significant. The most consistent element of the transmissions on this subject is an emphasis on readiness. That disclosure, whatever form it ultimately takes, is something that will occur when and as human consciousness is ready to receive it without the kind of destabilizing social collapse that an unprepared contact scenario could produce. The preparation of human consciousness for the reality of non-human intelligence through the gradual, witness-by-witness, community-by-community process of encounter and transformation that has been underway for decades, may itself be the disclosure process, operating at the level of individual and cultural consciousness rather than at the level of government announcement. The question of what comes next, of where the Mantis being phenomenon is heading, and what its implications are for the near and medium-term future of the human species, is one that any honest treatment must approach with considerable epistemic humility. The honest answer is that we do not know. The trajectory of the phenomenon suggests increasing contact, more witnesses, more diverse witnesses, more conscious and deliberate rather than nighttime invasion encounters. And the trajectory of official acknowledgement suggests an institutional context that is becoming, however slowly and reluctantly, more receptive to taking the phenomenon seriously. The intersection of these two trajectories, more contact, more acknowledgement, and a growing community of transformed witnesses who are actively engaged with the questions the Mantis beings raise, creates conditions for a cultural shift that could be significant. But significant in which direction? This is where the ambiguity of the Mantis beings' apparent agenda, the gap between the transformative care for human consciousness that the encounter experience implies and the involuntary, coercive dimensions that many witnesses emphasize, becomes most consequential. A culture that is being guided, however imperfectly and uncomfortably, by beings of vast experience and apparently genuine concern for the living world is in a very different situation from a culture that is being managed or harvested by beings whose interests are genuinely alien to human welfare. The evidence, read carefully and honestly, does not clearly support either of these simple models. It supports something more complex, a relationship that is neither benevolent in the simple sense nor malevolent in the simple sense, but that is genuinely consequential, genuinely ancient, and genuinely directed toward an end that the beings apparently regard as important enough to justify the intrusion and the coercion and the profound disruption that the contact process involves. The future that the Mantis beings appear to be preparing humanity for, insofar as any such future can be inferred from the accumulated transmissions and the pattern of transformations, is one in which the human species has a fundamentally different relationship with consciousness, with the living world, and with the wider community of intelligent life than it currently maintains. It is a future in which the boundaries of the individual self are experienced as more permeable and less absolute, in which the awareness of interconnection with other life, human, non-human, and something that exceeds the biological category entirely, is not a philosophical position, but a direct experiential reality, in which the cosmos is understood not as an indifferent physical system in which conscious life is an improbable accident, but as something more organized, more intentional, and more hospitable to the development of awareness than the current dominant scientific model acknowledges. Whether this future is possible, whether it can be reached before the ecological and social crises that the Mantis beings' communications identify as imminent produce consequences that make it unreachable, is the question that the beings themselves appear to regard as genuinely open. And it is the question that the human species, if it takes the phenomenon seriously, must begin to grapple with now. The open door, implications, integration, and the ongoing encounter. Every genuine inquiry ends not with a conclusion, but with a better question. The inquiry into the Mantis being phenomenon is no exception. What began, for most who encounter it seriously, as the question, "Are these beings real?" A question that feels satisfyingly binary, that promises the comfort of a yes or no, transforms, in the course of genuine engagement with the evidence, into a set of questions that are larger, more interesting, and more consequential than the original one. Questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to matter. Questions about the history of intelligent life on Earth and in the cosmos. Questions about what it means to be a human being in a universe that is, apparently, far more populated with intelligence and far more organized in its development of that intelligence than we have, until very recently, been willing to admit. And questions about what we owe each other and the living world and the future, given everything that the phenomenon suggests about what the stakes actually are. The integration of the Mantis being phenomenon into the broader human conversation about reality, consciousness, and our place in the cosmos is a project that is in its very early stages. The primary barrier to that integration has been social rather than evidential. The stigma, the institutional defensiveness, the professional and personal costs of taking these questions seriously in public that have, for decades, kept the conversation at the margins of respectable discourse. That barrier is weakening, not because the evidence has suddenly become overwhelming in a way that forces its dissolution, but because the combination of government acknowledgement, serious scientific engagement, and the growing community of transformed witnesses who are finding their voices has created a new context in which the questions can be asked more openly and heard more honestly than was possible before. The implications of the Mantis being phenomenon, taken seriously, are as large as any that humanity has ever had to grapple with. If these beings are real, if something corresponding to what thousands of independent witnesses describe has been present in human experience for as long as the record goes back, then everything about the human self-understanding is implicated. Our understanding of our own origins, of the development of our civilization, of the religious and mythological traditions that have shaped our deepest sense of meaning and value, our understanding of what consciousness is and what it is capable of, our understanding of what kind of cosmos we live in and what kind of company we keep in it. These are not small revisions to the existing picture. They are fundamental reorganizations of the picture itself. They require not just the addition of new information to existing frameworks, but the construction of new frameworks capable of accommodating information that the existing ones cannot hold. The construction of those new frameworks is already underway in the work of the researchers and theorists and experiencers who have been engaging with these questions for decades. It is underway in the developing sciences of consciousness, in the work of physicists who take seriously the idea that consciousness may be fundamental to the structure of reality rather than incidental to it, in the work of biologists who are beginning to appreciate the depth of intelligence that pervades the living world at every scale, in the work of neuroscientists who are mapping the brain states associated with extraordinary experiences and finding that those states are not pathological but represent a different mode of processing that the ordinary mode suppresses rather than produces. It is underway in the growing field of contact experience research, which is developing the methodological sophistication, the evidential standards, and the theoretical frameworks needed to engage with the phenomenon in a way that meets the requirements of serious inquiry. And it is underway in the private development of the tens of thousands of individuals who have had encounters with the Mantis Beings and who are, each in their own way, working out what those encounters mean and how to live in their light. The question of what the individual can do, given the weight of what the Mantis Being phenomenon implies, is one that each person must answer for themselves, and one that the beings themselves appear, through their encounter transmissions, to resist answering in any simple or prescriptive way. The Mantis Beings do not tell their witnesses what to do. They expand their witnesses' awareness and leave the application of that expanded awareness to the witness's own judgment and circumstance. This is itself significant. It suggests a respect for human agency that complicates any simple model of the beings as controllers or harvesters. The expansion of awareness without the imposition of a specific agenda is the behavior of something more like a teacher than a master. But it is also a teacher who does not make the exam easy and who is clear in the content of what they transmit about the urgency of the situation in which the student is operating. The urgency of the ecological situation, communicated with such consistency and such emotional intensity across the full breadth of the Mantis encounter literature, is, in the current moment, not merely a message from another intelligence. It is a scientific consensus that the mainstream of human civilization is struggling to respond to with anything like the adequacy that the situation demands. The Mantis Beings, in their communications, appear to be trying to contribute to that response, not by solving the ecological crisis through any direct intervention, but by expanding the consciousness of individuals who are then, in their own contexts and through their own choices, capable of contributing to a different relationship between the human species and the living world. Whether this is enough, whether the number and the influence of the transformed witnesses is sufficient to make a difference at the scale and in the time frame that the situation requires, is not a question that the beings seem to have answered definitively. It appears to be a genuinely open question, one that the outcome of the current critical period in Earth's history will answer, whether or not humanity is paying the kind of attention that would allow it to participate consciously in that outcome. The community of people who take the Mantis Being phenomenon seriously, researchers, experiencers, and the growing number of informed observers who have engaged with the evidence carefully enough to recognize that dismissal is no longer intellectually responsible, is part of the response to that urgency, not the whole of it, and not in a way that can yet claim anything like the cultural authority that the situation demands, but a beginning, a conversation, a gathering of people who have, for various reasons, come into contact with the possibility that the universe is stranger and richer and more organized than the conventional story admits, and who are trying to work out what that possibility means and what it asks of them. The Mantis Beings themselves, in the accounts of those who have encountered them, are patient. They have been waiting for a very long time for something that has not yet fully arrived. They will, apparently, continue to wait. They will continue to meet human beings in the vulnerable hours, to transmit what they have to transmit, to transform what they are able to transform, to pursue whatever purpose they are pursuing with the extraordinary combination of urgency and patience that characterizes every aspect of their documented presence. They are not, in any sense that the witness testimony supports, going away. Whatever they are, wherever they come from, whatever they ultimately want, they are here. They have been here, And the question of what that means and what it requires of the species they have apparently chosen to engage with is one of the most important questions of our time. The open door at the end of this inquiry is not a metaphor. It is a description of the actual situation. The encounter with the Mantis Beings is not a closed chapter in the history of anomalous human experience. It is a chapter that is actively, continuously being written in the lives of people across the world who are encountering something that changes them, that connects them to something larger than their ordinary life, and that sends them back into the world carrying a knowledge and a responsibility that they did not choose and cannot set down. The door is open. Something is standing in it. It has been standing there for longer than recorded history. And the question that it asks, standing there in the doorway of our awareness with its great dark eyes and its ancient patience and its urgent cosmic message, is simply this: are you ready finally to pay attention? The evidence says that the answer to that question is beginning slowly and incompletely, and with all the difficulty that such a recognition entails, to shift. The government hearings, the scientific acknowledgments, the growing public discourse, the community of witnesses finding their voices, these are the first signs of a species beginning to pay attention to something it has been avoiding, collectively, for a very long time. Whether the attention comes in time, whether it comes at the depth and the scale that the being's communications suggest, is necessary. Whether humanity can, in the window of time that appears to remain, achieve the consciousness of itself and its situation that the Mantis Beings have apparently been working to cultivate, is the question that no researcher and no witness and no government hearing can answer. It is the question that the next decades will answer in lives and choices and attention and the quality of the relationship that the human species is willing to establish, finally, with the intelligence that has been patiently, urgently, and enormously present at the edge of its awareness since the beginning. The Mantis Beings are the oldest company humanity has ever kept. They are the strangest. They are the most demanding and, perhaps in their way, the most faithful. The encounter with them is a mirror in which the human species can see something true about itself and about its situation if it has the courage to look. Not a comfortable truth, not a simple truth, but a truth that the full weight of the evidence, gathered by serious people over many decades, at personal and professional cost, with integrity and care, insists is there to be seen. The mirror is being held up. The invitation, if that is the right word for something so overwhelming and so involuntary, has been issued repeatedly to representatives of the human species across every culture and every generation. The response, so far, has been inadequate to the scale of what is being offered. But it is not too late, or at least the being's own communications suggest it is not yet too late. There is still a window, still an opportunity, still, in the vast patience of whatever the Mantis Beings represent, a willingness to wait for the human species to catch up to the reality of its own situation. That is where we are. That is what the evidence says. That is the question that the Mantis Being phenomenon, in all its complexity and its strangeness and its extraordinary consistency, ultimately poses. Not do aliens exist, not are we alone, but something harder and closer and more consequential than either of those. Something like, what are we in the full context of what we are embedded in, and what does that require of us now? The beings who have been asking that question, in their own way, for as long as the record goes back, are still asking it. They are asking it in the encounters that will happen tonight and tomorrow night and in every night that follows, in bedrooms and fields and military facilities and suburban homes across the world, to people who are, in one moment, ordinary members of the human species going about their ordinary lives, and in the next moment, witnesses to something so extraordinary that the rest of their lives will be organized around the attempt to understand and integrate and respond to it. The question is in the air, the door is open, the beings are waiting, and the only remaining question, the practical, urgent, immediate question, is what we do with the fact that we finally, after all this time, know they are there. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.